Hello fellow Sapiens, and welcome back to Midnight Sapien. Whether you're walking under quiet streetlights, drifting into sleep beside someone you love, or just filling the stillness of a solitary room, you are welcome here. Because tonight we're asking a question that echoes across tens of thousands of winters. Did tribalism, the force that binds and divides, save our ancestors from extinction? This is calm storytelling and deep-time science for curious minds. This is an untold story about survival, a tale shaped by the silence of extinction, the warmth of shared firelight, and the long shadow of an ancient allegiance. But it begins not with an invention, or even with a tool. It begins with a feeling. Not the need for shelter, the need to belong, and if you're the kind of strange and wonderful human who seeks meaning in the quiet, who enjoys slow science and long-form thought, then look just below the video. There's a button that says subscribe. You can tap it now. You can always unsubscribe later. And the little bell next to it? That lets you know when the next story arrives. Subscribing helps this channel survive. Without it, these videos can't continue to be made. Also, I'm wondering, where are you listening from tonight? What time is it for you right now? If you feel like sharing, tell me in the comments. It's a quiet way of remembering that we are listening together. And if you fall asleep, that's okay. Timestamps are in the description. Now, let us begin with a firelit circle in the dark. The story begins at the threshold of the void, a vast silence rimmed with ice, where the breath of extinction still lingers in the frozen soil. And in that silence, one question hums beneath it all. Why are we still here? What secret thread kept our fragile species alive while others, stronger, hardier, more ancient, vanished forever into the snow? What is it, hidden and unseen, that pulled Homo sapiens through the darkest winters the Earth has ever known? Could it have been something softer than stone, more enduring than fire? Could it have been tribalism, not the kind that sparks hatred in modern streets, but something older, purer, a sacred logic of belonging that saved us when the world turned to glass? To understand how improbable our survival truly was, we must begin by stepping back, not decades or centuries, but tens of thousands of years, to a time when the world was not ruled by humans, but haunted by them. We were never alone. Once there were many kinds of human beings. Homo erectus, the long walker, had already roamed the earth for nearly 2 million years. Neanderthals carved out a dominion of bone and fire in the caves of Europe, while Denisovans, elusive as shadows, left only fragments of themselves in the mountains of Siberia. In the dense green of Indonesia, Homo floresiensis, small, clever and strange, survived on their lonely island far longer than we once believed. Each of these was human. Each of them made tools. Some buried their dead. Some painted. All of them, in time, were undone. The earth changed. Slowly, brutally, the ice began to return. It was not a single winter, but a grinding epoch. A sculptor with frozen hands carving away at the living world. Forests withered. Herds vanished. Glaciers advanced with the patience of millennia, remaking the continent inch by inch. Survival, once difficult, became almost impossible. This was not merely cold, it was pressure, relentless and indifferent, and it crushed many of our cousins into silence. Yet somehow, we remained, not without cost, the genetic record whispers of a near death. There were moments long ago when our species may have dwindled to fewer than 10,000 breeding individuals. Imagine that. All of us, everything we are, descended from a cluster of scattered groups, clinging to life in the wind-blown shadows of a dying planet. How did we do it? Why us, and not them? Was it technology? Perhaps. But Neanderthals had tools as refined as ours. Was it language? Possibly. But recent evidence suggests others may have spoken too. Was it something else entirely? Something invisible in the archaeological record, yet woven deep into the marrow of our behaviour? That question leads us toward the idea at the heart of this story, an idea that waits quietly behind every burial site, every painted wall, every ring of stones on a cave floor. What if we survived not because we were smarter, faster or stronger, but because we belonged to each other? What happens when a species learns to hold each other through the dark? Somewhere in the long corridors of the Ice Age, the human story began to narrow. its many branches trimmed back by cold, famine, and time itself. One by one, the others vanished. The Neanderthals of the Western Mountains, the Denisovans of the high Siberian plains, the distant echoes of Homo erectus fading into dust. And with each extinction, one question deepens. What made us different? Why did Homo sapiens, a soft and slender creature of bone and breath, endure when the world was so merciless? Why us, and not them? The answer, perhaps, begins not in our muscles or our minds, but in our closeness, in our ability to become more than individuals. The Ice Age was not a single storm or a moment of catastrophe. It was a sentence written across 10,000 generations. Ice advanced, withdrew, then advanced again. Valleys that once held grass became mirrors of frozen glass. Rivers stood still, mountains wept, glaciers, and even the sky seemed to harden with cold. In such a world, survival was no longer about dominance, it was about endurance. And endurance, as it turned out, was best achieved together. Our ancestors learned this deeply. They gathered around firelight, their faces painted red with ochre, their words, if words yet existed, woven with care and promise. They crafted small tools, carved bones into flutes, and buried their dead beneath layers of stone and petals. These were not the actions of creatures running from extinction. They were declarations of belonging, a refusal to disappear unnoticed. When the earth turned hostile, Homo sapiens turned inward, toward one another, and found strength in connection. Neanderthals too loved and mourned. They tended their injured, they shared shelter. But the archaeological record suggests their social webs were smaller, tighter, and less connected across distance. Their tribes were islands, ours were rivers. Ideas and stories flowed between groups of sapiens scattered across continents. A better spear point discovered in one camp could reach another hundreds of miles away. Shell beads from distant coasts appear buried with inland dwellers. There was communication, cooperation, perhaps even trade, and in a collapsing world that network became a lifeline. This is where the mystery begins to take shape. Perhaps survival was not granted by nature, but earned through communion. When the winds rose and the herds fled south, those who could rely on others, who could share, comfort and remember, had a chance to endure. Each human became a vessel of knowledge and empathy, carrying the tribe's memory forward through famine and frost. And so, the difference may have been invisible, a gesture, a shared glance, a fire passed from one camp to the next. Perhaps it was not strength that saved us, but the tenderness to remain. Because in a world made of ice and silence, the only warmth that lasted was the warmth we gave each other. That warmth wasn't just emotional. It was strategic, ancestral, embedded. It was what allowed Homo sapiens to organize at a scale that reached beyond the familiar, beyond the immediate kin group. It was the quiet beginning of something vast, a social architecture built not from stone or bone, but from obligation, memory, and belief. A tribe was not simply a cluster of bodies. It was a container for stories, for rituals, for ways of making sense of suffering. And in the age of ice, suffering was constant. How, then, did we endure it? Archaeological evidence suggests that sapiens began to form larger, more flexible social networks than any other hominin before us. These were not just extended families, but interlocking systems of clans, each with its own customs, but linked by symbols, trade, and shared myths. Objects like pierced shells, ochre handprints, and sacred carvings appear across enormous distances, as if messages had been passed from one generation to the next, not by chance, but by design. Such systems may have allowed sapiens groups to exchange information about animal migrations, safe shelter, or medicinal plants. More crucially, they enabled us to foster trust across distances, to cooperate with those we might never meet again. What kind of mind creates such a world? What kind of nervous system can imagine the interior life of another? Some researchers call it theory of mind, the ability to attribute thoughts, feelings, and intentions to others. But perhaps it is something deeper still, the ability to care, to understand that someone else's life matters, even when it offers no benefit to our own. This is not altruism in the abstract. It is the slow accumulation of countless acts of compassion, sharing dried meat, watching over a sick child, defending a vulnerable elder. These behaviours are not unique to us. Other primates care, mourn, protect, but nowhere else do we see such care transformed into structure. In Sapiens, concern became culture, and that culture became survival. Consider this. In a world where danger came from every direction, where a single injury could mean death, the safest place was not behind a wall. It was inside a story that told you who you were, who your people were, what the fire meant, what the bones meant, what the stars were saying in their silence. These stories were not entertainment, they were infrastructure. They carried codes for cooperation, for identity, for obligation, and when carried well, they could outlive even the death of a tribe. In that sense, tribalism was never a luxury. It was a technology, a living system engineered not in laboratories but through ritual, repetition, and the long dance of memory. And the more inhospitable the world became, the more that system was tested, refined, and vitalized. So what if survival wasn't just about adaptation to environment, but adaptation to each other? To live through the Ice Age was not only to face the cold, but to navigate the labyrinth of other minds. In the relentless silence of glacial winds, communication became a kind of warmth. Every glance, every gesture, every shared breath around a dying fire was part of a grammar older than language. And somewhere within this quiet choreography of mutual care, we began to develop a deeper kind of knowing, not just who we were, but who we were to one another. There is evidence that early Homo sapiens built shared spaces, not just shelters, but gathering sites, places of congregation that may have served spiritual or social purposes beyond daily survival. Great stones arranged in patterns, pits filled with pigments, animal bones arranged like offerings. These are not the actions of beings focused solely on the hunt. They suggest a species preoccupied with connection, with reverence, with maintaining bonds across distance and death. And what holds such a structure together? Not just food or fire, but a sense of us. The evolution of tribal identity may have started with blood, but it did not end there. Over time it expanded, first to allies, then to symbolic kin, and eventually to those who shared stories, not genes. Belonging became portable. You could be part of the group if you understood its rituals, its markings, its sacred songs. You could join not by birth, but by recognition. That was revolutionary, because in a cold, breaking world, that flexibility could mean the difference between extinction and expansion. If a stranger could become kin, if an outsider could be folded into the tribe, then survival could ripple outward, not as isolation, but as inclusion. That inclusion had limits, of course, but even those limits served a purpose. They defined the boundaries of trust, a necessary clarity when resources were few and the night was long. And still there is something haunting in the remains, the burial of a child with a carved ivory pendant. The careful placement of red ochre beneath the skull of a fallen woman, the presence of pollen in graves as if flowers were laid in farewell. These are not anomalies, they are echoes, moments where love and memory collided and left behind a mark. We buried each other, we remembered, and that remembrance stitched us into something larger than the individual. What does it mean to matter when you may not survive the season? What does it mean to die if others carry your name? In that sense, tribalism was not just a way of organising people, it was a way of carrying meaning forward when all else was slipping away. And perhaps it was that meaning, that shared thread of identity and purpose that pulled us through the frost. What if it was never the tribe that needed survival, but survival that needed the tribe? As the Ice Age deepened, it carved away the unnecessary. Forests turned to tundra. Lakes froze into silence. The air thinned and hardened. In some regions, the average temperature dropped by more than 15 degrees. The world itself seemed to shudder beneath the weight of its own coldness. And yet, in this narrowing corridor of existence, something within us expanded. Not our bodies, we remained small and soft, but our circles, our rituals, our memory of each other. It's easy to forget that we came this close to vanishing. Geneticists speak of a bottleneck, a moment when our entire species may have been reduced to a few thousand individuals, scattered across Africa and beyond, separated by climate and distance, but still connected by some invisible thread. Imagine that. The whole of humanity balanced on the edge of erasure, kept alive not by conquest, but by cohesion. What held that thread? Perhaps it was the songs sung by firelight, the careful watching over sleeping children, the long walks across frozen valleys with shared burdens on tired backs. Survival, in this sense, was never an individual act. It was an orchestra. Each member of a group played a part: gatherer, hunter, healer, watcher, storyteller, and each depended on the others in a way that was not optional, but existential. No one knew everything, but everyone knew someone. And it was this web of interdependence that gave our ancestors resilience. In the bones of those who lived and died in that era, there are signs not only of hardship, but of healing. Fractures that mended, diseases that ran their course, injuries that would have meant death if the wounded had been abandoned. But they weren't. They were carried, fed, protected. That means something. It means the tribe was not a strategy, it was a commitment. One made again and again, even when it cost more than it gave. And perhaps, in that commitment, something else was born. Identity. Not just who are you, but who are we, together. It's no coincidence that the first signs of symbolic behaviour, art, ornament, ritual, begin to cluster in this same period. They were not decoration, they were declarations. This is our group. These are our dead. These are our truths. In a world where nothing could be owned, not even the sky, these symbols became the architecture of meaning. So did tribalism save us in the Ice Age? Perhaps it did. Not as ideology, not as warfare, not as exclusion, but as a structure for love, obligation, and memory. A scaffolding of survival, built not of stone, but of arms wrapped around shoulders and names whispered across generations, and in that fragile structure, tested again and again by the wind and the cold and the hunger, something held, and that is why we are here. Not because we outfought the cold, but because we outloved it, and in that love, a new kind of warmth began to flicker, not in the body, but in the mind. Somewhere in the Paleolithic dark, beneath canopies of stars and the howling breath of ice, small bands of humans gathered around fragile flames. The fire did more than keep predators away, or heat the marrow from broken bones. It created a centre, a place to return to, a shared point around which thought could spiral and emotion could anchor. In the firelit circle, something old and animal softened, and something entirely new began. What happens to a mind that lives in constant proximity to others, that wakes and sleeps beside the same voices, that reads the faces of the same 12, 20, 30 people every single day for a lifetime? We evolved in intimacy. We were shaped not in cities or temples, but in huts made of branches and hides, wrapped in the breath of those we trusted, and that trust rewired us. Scientists now speak of the social brain, a network of neural adaptations tuned not for solitude, but for cooperation. Compared to our ancestors, our brains grew disproportionately large in areas responsible for empathy, memory, and prediction of other minds. We became creatures of feeling, not by accident, but by necessity. To live was to remember not just the world, but each other, who had been injured, who had lost a child, who told the best stories, who was drifting into grief. In the small circles of Paleolithic life, each person became a mirror. Emotions echoed back and forth in a closed loop, and the group itself became a single organism, sensitive, reactive, whole. When one wept, others comforted. When one found danger, others fled. It was a symphony of subtle signals, posture, tone, breath. And around the fire, those signals became rituals. Because the fire was more than heat. It was stage and sanctuary, memory and mirror. As the flames danced, so did the stories. And those stories were not merely told, they were performed. With gesture, with rhythm, with repetition. They became the way we pass time, but also the way we pass self. A story could hold a lesson, a fear, a secret. It could encode a map. It could preserve a mistake. The child who heard it at 7 might repeat it at 70, word for word, because the group needed it to stay the same. Through stories, information stopped dying with the body. And it's here, in these glowing half-circles beneath the rock shelters and forest canopies, that something sacred took root. Symbolic behaviour. We began to paint not animals, but ideas. A handprint on a cave wall. a row of dots, a spiral. These were not decorations, they were declarations. I was here. We were here. This is what we see. This is what we believe. What must it have felt like to see your own mind reflected in the flame and know you were not alone? Somewhere in that reflection, a threshold was crossed. No longer were we simply reacting to the world. We were beginning to recreate it, inside ourselves and for one another. A cry could become a rhythm. A gesture could become a sign. A memory could become a myth. And all of it could be passed forward, polished like stone through generations of telling and retelling. This was the quiet birth of culture, not as institution or empire, but as the invisible skin between one life and the next. And it grew, moment by moment, in the hush between words around the fire. What changes when a mind becomes symbolic? When a sound can point not to an object, but to a feeling, a warning, a dream? The roots of language, though elusive, may have curled up from these intimate spaces, where shared understanding was vital and confusion could mean death. Here, in these dim-lit circles, language may have evolved not to give instructions, but to give comfort. Not to command, but to connect. Because even before syntax, before vocabulary, came rhythm, tone, and presence. The voice became a tool not only of communication, but of cohesion. It stitched people together across silence. And with language came memory's second skin, ritual, the repeated, the sacred, the known, a rhythm of movement or sound that created structure and chaos. It may have begun simply, a dance before a hunt, a chant before sleep. But it grew into something larger, a scaffold for the invisible, for hopes, for fears, for grief too heavy to carry alone. In ritual, pain became shareable, loss became legible. Around the fire, those who had buried children or watched elders fade could witness their sorrow mirrored in others and named without words. That naming, that acknowledgement, became a balm. This is why the first evidence of burial is not a curiosity, it is a revolution. To bury the dead is not simply to dispose of remains, it is to insist that a body has meaning even after breath has gone. It is to hold the silence and say, this mattered. The earliest graves we find are modest, but not careless. Bodies arranged with intention, objects placed gently near hands or heads, red ochre dusted over bone, like blood remembered. In some cases, the dead were returned to the earth with tools, beads, or even flowers. These acts were not utilitarian, they were symbolic, a signal from the living to the unknown. And what does it mean to mourn? To stand in the flicker of firelight, holding the hand of one who still breathes while speaking to one who no longer does? It means we had crossed into something new. We were no longer just surviving, we were remembering. We were crafting meaning from absence, weaving together past, present, and imagined futures in the warmth of one another's presence. What happens to a species that learns to keep its dead close? It begins to build a world not only of things, but of meanings. When the dead are remembered, they do not entirely leave. Their names, their stories, their gestures survive in the mouths and movements of those who remain. Around the fire, memory becomes performance. It becomes myth. It becomes a lineage not of blood alone, but of voice. And in this fragile loop of telling and retelling, we start to see the earliest architecture of human time. Not the endless now of the animal, but a past that can be visited and a future that can be imagined. This is not merely sentiment, it is infrastructure. The social memory that outlasts the individual becomes a kind of map, a guide through terrain, both physical and emotional, where to find the herds, where the danger lives, who betrayed the group in a famine long ago, who gave more than they had. Such stories shaped behaviour, carried expectation, enforced trust. They were not merely recollections, they were currency. The fire became the vault in which this currency was stored, exchanged, invested in the next generation. And so, the group itself evolved. No longer just a biological unit, it became a symbolic one. To be part of the circle was not only to share food or warmth, it was to share meaning. That meaning was expressed in stories, rituals, gestures, even in silence. A bowed head, a painted hand, a carved line in stone. These were the first sentences written not in words, but in presence. What makes a group stable across time? It is not dominance, it is not fear, it is shared belief. And belief, however fragile, however unspoken, binds people in ways no predator ever could. In the Paleolithic world, belief may have begun as a whisper, a superstition, a pattern noticed in shadow. But through repetition, it became real. Not because it could be proven, but because it could be shared. And once shared, it could protect. Some archaeologists speak of the Upper Paleolithic as a cognitive revolution, a sudden blossoming of complexity in the human mind. Cave paintings, figurines, composite tools. But perhaps it was not a revolution in cognition at all. Perhaps the change was social. Perhaps the Firelit circle was the catalyst, the crucible in which these ideas took form and were refined by company, by conflict, by care. One mind alone may imagine a god, but it takes a group to believe in one, and belief leaves marks, in ochre smeared across foreheads, in beads buried with the fallen, in the deliberate placement of a body facing west. These are not practical acts, they are poems, they are prayers, they are the first echoes of abstraction turned to ritual. They suggest not only grief, but reverence, not only memory, but a reaching towards something beyond. What must it have meant to sit beside a dying flame, gaze at the stars and wonder not only what is out there, but who is watching back? That moment, the one where the unknown becomes inhabited, where the silence of the cosmos begins to whisper a name, marks the edge of something extraordinary. It signals the birth of the sacred, the dawning of a question that would never again leave us. Why are we here? Not how, not when, not where, but why. And in the hush of the Paleolithic night, beneath the wheeling constellations and the soft breath of sleeping kin, this question did not demand an answer. It demanded meaning. Fire did not only warm our bodies, it illuminated our inner worlds. In its flickering glow we began to project our fears, our hopes, our ancestors. Shadows on cave walls became stories, sparks became souls, and the circle that gathered each night was not just a place of survival, it was a place of transformation, a theatre, a sanctuary, a school, and perhaps most crucially, a mirror. Around the fire, each face reflected back not only who we were, but who we might become. Children watched elders. Elders remembered youth. The slow, repetitive rhythm of life etched itself into rituals, of coming of age, of mourning, of preparation for the hunt or the winter. These rhythms created continuity. They told the group who they were across generations. Without writing, without stone monuments, humans created continuity through ceremony, through breath and voice and repetition. And in this we began to lay a time. The dead were not gone, the unborn were not strangers. The fire held all of them. Some anthropologists call this the emergence of ancestral consciousness, the awareness that you are part of a chain, one link in a long unfolding. This was not biology, it was myth. But myth, in that world, had power. It taught responsibility, it offered purpose, it framed suffering in narrative, and in doing so it made suffering bearable. The fire also served another more delicate role. It equalized the night. When flames flickered in the center of the circle, no one stood above or below. There was no throne, no gate, only faces, all made strange and beautiful by the light. In that symmetry, perhaps something democratic began to form. A tribe was not a hierarchy. It was a breathing, shifting negotiation of presence and voice. Who spoke when? Who was listened to? Who sang the songs? Who remembered the names? And what did those names mean? They were more than identifiers. They were vessels. Each name carried a story, a temperament, a lineage. To be named was to be known, and to be remembered by name after death was to still belong. It's possible that names were among the earliest sacred things, because a name could summon the past. It could call across absence. It could survive the body. So what does it mean that we named each other before we named the stars? It means that meaning began at the centre, between eyes, between hands, between voices, before it reached outward into the night sky. The Firelit circle was humanity's first cathedral, not built from stone, but from breath, proximity, and the shared act of looking inward together. In that circle, the cosmos wasn't yet a map or a mechanism. It was a reflection of us. The pulse of the stars echoed the rhythm of our stories. The arc of the moon paralleled the arc of a life. The sky was not distant, it was intimate, and perhaps it still is. From these first gatherings came a cascade of transformations. As rituals deepened, as stories layered, something subtle but irreversible began to shift in the architecture of the brain. We weren't just surviving in groups, we were being shaped by them. The human mind, born of firelight and narrative, evolved in concert with other minds. Mirror neurons, oxytocin, the limbic resonance of synchronized breathing. All of these physiological systems speak to a truth older than history. We were never meant to be alone. The consequences of that intimacy shaped everything that followed. Art was not born in solitude. It was born in the presence of others. The handprint on the cave wall is not just a personal act. It is a message to the group, a signal of participation, of identity. I am here. I am one of you. And perhaps, too, it is a message to the unknown. Do not forget me. That desire, not merely to live, but to be remembered, threads its way through every archaeological layer of our ancestry. It whispers from ochre-stained burials. It lingers in the arrangement of animal bones, in the carvings of mothers and beasts. Each gesture a kind of defiance, each ritual a kind of prayer, and all of it rooted in the daily reality of small groups living and dying together. These were not civilizations, they were not empires, they were not even villages. They were bands, 20 or 30 people bound by trust and rhythm, navigating ice, wind, and time. But in those bands, everything was encoded. The architecture of cooperation, the birth of belonging, the raw material of what would one day become law, religion, science, and song. It is easy to look back and see only survival, spears, scraped hides, cold. But that is not the whole story. Around the fire, we see something else. Beauty, intention, meaning. A people not just enduring the world, but beginning to interpret it. And that interpretation began with each other. Because before there were gods, there were ancestors. Before there were nations, there were names. And before there were monuments carved from stone, there were circles drawn in ash around quiet fires. Where someone once whispered a story and someone else listened and the stars above said nothing, but somehow they heard. So what is left of those fires now? What still burns? The answer, perhaps, lies not in the ashes, but in the architecture of our minds. For even when the flames are gone and the circle is dissolved into history, the pattern remains. Embedded deep in the folds of the human brain is a truth we cannot escape. We were shaped to belong. Our nervous systems, our emotions, even our perception of self, none of these evolved in isolation. They were sculpted by a world made of others, others we had to understand. Others we had to trust, others we could not survive without. This truth is not poetic, it is biological. The human neocortex, the part of our brain most associated with higher reasoning, imagination, and planning, is also profoundly social. Compared to other primates, our neocortex is disproportionately large. Why? Not merely to invent tools or navigate terrain, but to navigate each other. Our ancestors who best predicted the intentions of others, who remembered past betrayals, who interpreted the flick of an eye or the edge of a smile, those were the ones who endured. Their brains passed forward a gift, the ability to live inside the minds of others while remaining inside their own. This gift came with a price. To belong is not merely to be seen, it is to be bound. Bound by memory, by expectation, by the constant awareness that every action is watched, measured, judged. And from this crucible of constant observation emerge strange and powerful tools. Tools not made of stone or bone, but of emotion, shame, guilt, embarrassment. These were not weaknesses, they were regulators. Internal signals designed to keep us aligned with the group. To violate a rule was not just to risk punishment, it was to risk exile. And in the Paleolithic world, exile often meant death. How many of our modern anxieties are echoes of that ancient fear? How much of our identity is shaped not by what we love, but by what others expect us to be? From birth, we are wired to notice faces, track expressions, and seek approval. We long for inclusion as we long for air. And this longing helped build societies far larger and more complex than any other primate could imagine. But it also placed limits, soft boundaries carved by the brain itself. Enter Dunbar's number. Named after anthropologist Robin Dunbar, this number, roughly 150, represents the estimated maximum number of meaningful social relationships a human can maintain at once. Beyond that, cohesion begins to fracture, trust weakens, gossip becomes noise. So even as we grew in number, our deepest tribal wiring remained tuned to intimacy. We were built for villages, not cities. Circles, not crowds. Faces, not algorithms. What does it mean then to live in a body built for connection, but in a world that often exceeds its design? What happens to a social brain when its tribe becomes too large to know, too abstract to feel? And what ancient instincts still steer us in that invisible space between isolation and belonging? The answer moves like wind through tall grass, quiet, constant, shaping the field without ever being seen. These instincts are not loud, they are not conscious, they are felt in the tightening of the chest when excluded from a group, in the flush of relief when someone meets your gaze and smiles, in the strange ache that follows silence after laughter shared. We do not choose these reactions, they choose us, because long before we had nations or neighbourhoods, we had tribes, and in those tribes, inclusion was survival. To hold that inclusion in place, something subtle had to evolve, a mechanism for social coherence, both flexible and firm. That mechanism was gossip. To gossip is to narrate the social world in real time. It is not mere frivolity, it is intelligence turned inward, aimed not at predators or prey, but at people. Who broke a rule? Who shared food? Who slept beside whom? Who betrayed a secret? In the Paleolithic world, where there were no laws or written contracts, gossip became a kind of soft surveillance. It enforced norms without violence, it corrected behaviour without exile, it created reputation, the invisible currency of tribal life, and it required something even deeper, shared attention. A group had to agree on what mattered. A story told in private was one thing, but when repeated and reinforced, when nodded to and whispered across the fire, it became truth. And from these whispers came a new kind of identity. Not just who am I, but who are we? This is the birth of shared identity, the ability to see yourself not only as an individual, but as a vessel of group memory, values, roles. You became someone because others believed you were. The cost of that belief was pressure. Social life became a tightrope. One misstep could shift your position in the group forever. Yet the reward was immense: protection, purpose, place. And so, the human mind adapted further. We became skilled in self-monitoring. We learned to track how others saw us. We developed internal voices that whispered, even in solitude, the imagined judgments of those around us. And still, it wasn't enough to avoid doing harm. Eventually, we had to feel what others felt. Empathy, then, became our most advanced survival trait. Not because it made us kind, but because it made us cohesive. When you can feel another's pain as your own, you're less likely to inflict it. When you can sense their joy, you're more likely to contribute to it. These emotions bound us more tightly than any rope or law ever could. But empathy, like fire, can burn both ways. What happens when we extend it only to those who look like us, speak like us, live like us? What happens when our circle of concern becomes a wall instead of a bridge? And are the boundaries of us drawn by choice, or by something older, deeper, and harder to rewrite? Because if the need to belong shaped our minds, it also shaped our exclusions. For every firelit circle that brought warmth and meaning, there was always an edge beyond which they began. And the brain, so gifted in weaving empathy within the group, began to struggle when facing the unknown beyond it. Familiar faces invited connection, unfamiliar ones invited caution. Or worse, this wasn't hatred, it was vigilance. A nervous system tuned for pattern, alert to disruption, wary of anything that might fracture the delicate balance of the group. This is the paradox of tribal life. The same circuits that allowed for deep love, loyalty, and sacrifice within the tribe also carried the seeds of suspicion, gossip, and division between tribes. Evolution did not ask for fairness, it asked for function. And function, in a small band world, often meant prioritizing your own. To survive, we had to know who could be trusted. To thrive, we had to make sure that trust was maintained. In that environment, Moral behaviour wasn't abstract, it was local, which is why shame became such a powerful tool. Unlike guilt, which is internal and individual, shame is relational. It tells you not just that you've done wrong, but that you've been seen doing wrong. It is the fire in your cheeks when eyes turn toward you. It is the stomach's collapse when laughter dies. It evolved not as punishment, but as prevention. To be shamed was to be warned. You are drifting from the group's centre. Return, or risk losing everything. And we returned. Again and again. Sometimes with silence, sometimes with apology, sometimes with ritual. Shame guided behaviour, but it also taught repair. And in that repair, groups could grow stronger. Bonds frayed by error could be rewoven by recognition. This is what made tribal cohesion so powerful. It wasn't perfect harmony, but dynamic alignment. A constant living calibration of emotion and attention, correction and forgiveness. And within that calibration lived another powerful force, mimicry. We watched others and mirrored them, posture, tone, speech. Not out of pretense, but instinct. To fit in was to survive, and the brain rewarded signs of alignment with oxytocin, serotonin, dopamine. Belonging felt good, chemically and emotionally. The group wasn't just a structure, it was a drug. But what happens when the group becomes wrong? When cruelty is rewarded? When exclusion becomes ritualized? Here we see the darker legacy of the social brain. Its genius is not moral clarity, it is cohesion. And cohesion can bind people to terrible things. History shows us again and again how shared identity, when manipulated, can become a weapon. So how do we define the limits of our empathy? What draws the line between inclusion and cruelty? And in a brain so shaped by others, how much of what we call the self was ever truly ours to begin with? From the moment we are born, we're bathed in signals that tell us who we are allowed to be. A newborn does not arrive with identity, it arrives with potential, and that potential is carved by the faces, tones and touch that surround it. Even before words, we learn the shape of belonging. We learn which cries bring comfort, which smiles return to us, which silences carry danger. Our nervous system calibrates to the social field like a compass to a magnetic pole, and slowly, almost invisibly, the self becomes a reflection of what the group allows. This shaping is not passive, it is fierce. To the child, rejection is not metaphorical, it is existential, and the adult is no different. We are social, not by preference, but by design. Neuroscience shows us that the pain of social exclusion activates the same brain regions as physical injury. Loneliness is not merely unpleasant, it is corrosive. Chronic isolation is linked to inflammation, immune dysfunction, and even early death. To be cut off from the group is not simply sad, it is a biological threat. So we adapt, we conform, we perform, but we also imagine. Because alongside this social pressure lives a hidden engine, the narrative mind. We do not merely react to what others think, we construct stories about it. We guess their thoughts, we craft our identities around anticipated judgment. This is not deception, it is survival, and it is astonishingly complex. A single human can juggle dozens of overlapping roles: child, parent, healer, hunter, rival, lover, all depending on context, all mediated through memory and emotion. And yet, within this dance of selves, there is something else: coherence. The social brain does not just fragment, it integrates. Through language, through ritual, through symbol, we weave these selves into something durable. That weaving is what we call culture. Culture is not imposed. It emerges from countless micro-adjustments, mirrored gazes, repeated stories, and it is in culture that the group and the self become one. But culture, like memory, is fragile. It can be interrupted. It can be hijacked. In times of fear or scarcity, the brain's old wiring tightens. The group shrinks. Suspicion rises. Complexity gives way to simplicity. Us and them. This is not evil. It is ancient. And it is precisely in these moments that the social brain reveals its double edge, its power to unite and its equal power to exclude. Still, something remarkable happened in the deep past. Some groups somehow managed to widen their circles. Through ritual, trade, intermarriage, shared symbols, perhaps even shared dreams, They built bridges across boundaries. They created alliances larger than blood, identities larger than the campfire. These expansions were rare and they were risky, but they were real, and maybe they hold a key. Because what if the most radical act in human history was not the formation of a tribe, but the moment we decided to let someone in, to expand the boundaries of belonging beyond the known, the familiar, the kin, is not just a social shift, it is an evolutionary gamble. In the Paleolithic world, trust was a currency hard-earned and easily shattered, yet the archaeological record hints at moments where our ancestors took that risk. Tools traded across regions, ornament styles shared between groups, burial sites containing individuals from different gene pools. These were not accidents, they were acts of connection, evidence that sometimes we reached beyond the firelit circle, and what allowed that reach? Not strength, not numbers, but something softer, a capacity for imagination, the ability to see the self in the other, to sense a thread of familiarity in difference. This is the deeper magic of the social brain, not just its power to form groups, but its power to reform them, to stretch, to reshape, to adapt. From this came identity, not as a rigid structure, but as a flowing current, a story told again and again, revised with every retelling. You belonged not because of what you were, but because of what the group believed you were becoming. Identity was not a prison. It was a bridge between memory and possibility. And to guard that identity, new tools emerged, rituals that marked entry, tests that earned trust, symbols that signalled allegiance. These were the ancestors of our modern customs, our flags, our names, even our clothing. Each one a silent contract, each one a thread in the web of shared meaning. Because in a world without written language, culture had to be visible to be believed. But even these threads were not unbreakable. When pressure rose, when food grew scarce or threats loomed, identity often collapsed inward. The circle shrank, outsiders became enemies, suspicion hardened, and the brain, so skilled at empathy, redirected its gifts into strategy, into conflict, into survival. History did not invent war. The capacity was always there, buried beneath layers of cooperation. The miracle is not that humans fought, it's that we ever chose not to. Still, amid the shifting tides of trust and fear, one thing remained constant. We needed each other, always, in every era. The infant needed a caregiver, the elder needed the memory of the group, the wounded needed help, the grieving needed witness. We were born fragile and stayed fragile. Our strength was never in our bodies, it was in our bonds. And that is the paradox at the heart of the human story. We are at once the most cooperative and the most divisive species on Earth. We form nations and draw borders. We build cities and invent walls. We love with ferocity and exclude with precision. All of it wired into a brain evolved not to be alone, and yet always afraid of being too vulnerable. So what does it mean to live in a world made of others? It means our greatest challenge was never survival. It was staying open to each other, even when the world told us to close. Before tribalism became a wall, it began as a shelter. Not from violence, not from enemies, but from the biting wind and the hollow ache of need. In the long winter of the world, survival was not a solitary achievement. It was a gift passed hand to hand, one mouth fed because another had gone without, one wound bound because another pair of hands had reached across the fire. Altruism was not a philosophy. It was a reflex, ancient and urgent, and at its heart was a logic both simple and profound. If I help you today, you may help me tomorrow. But how does generosity survive in a world of scarcity? Why give away what you might not recover? Why risk warmth, food, energy for someone else? The answer lies not in morality, but in evolution. In the frozen crucible of the Pleistocene, cooperation wasn't noble, it was necessary. Those who shared survived, and those who survived shaped the future. Across thousands of generations, selection favoured not the ruthless loner, but the one who could be counted on. Those who cared for others, especially kin, saw more of their genes carried forward. This is the essence of kin selection, the understanding that helping relatives, even at a cost to the self, could ensure the survival of shared blood, but the net cast wider than blood. Even among non-relatives, humans developed something even more astonishing: reciprocal altruism. A ledger, invisible but remembered, emerged between minds. I give to you, and someday you will give to me. This dance of mutual aid formed the backbone of early human society. Trust became a currency, memory became a vault, and reputation, whispers passed from ear to ear, became a kind of social gravity, pulling some into the centre, casting others to the edge. And so kindness flourished, but not freely. It moved within boundaries, curled tight around those who belonged. Because while the brain evolved to feel joy in giving, it also evolved to fear exploitation. Generosity required risk, and to minimize that risk we began to draw lines. Who is worthy of my help? Who shares my burdens? Who will remember my sacrifice? And just as quickly, who will not? Here, empathy, the very heart of human connection, reveals its double edge. Because empathy is not evenly distributed. It is not a beam of light that shines on all. It is a lantern turned inward, illuminating the familiar, the face of a friend, a sibling, a child. These stir the deepest instinct to protect. But a stranger, a rival, someone outside the circle, the light flickers, the warmth fades, and what was once compassion becomes calculation. How did this happen? Why would a mind so attuned to care be so quick to withhold it? Perhaps because the very sensitivity that made us capable of profound connection also made us exquisitely attuned to betrayal. The closer we became, the more costly it was to be deceived. And so kindness, to endure, required boundaries. And those boundaries became walls. And those walls, in time, became tribes. It began quietly, not as a declaration, but as a feeling. A subtle tightening of attention around the familiar, around those who spoke your language, shared your fire, carried your memories. They were safe. They were us. The world beyond that circle was not necessarily hostile, but it was uncertain. And in a landscape where uncertainty could kill, even hesitation could be fatal. The result was not hatred, but preference, an instinctual gravity drawing care inward, like warmth curling around a hearth. This is the paradox of empathy. The more deeply we feel it for those close to us, the less we have left to give to those far away. It is not infinite, it is selective, and that selectivity once kept us alive. Imagine a small band of humans crossing a frozen plain, their food dwindling, their firewood gone. The decision of who eats and who waits is not a moral question. It's a survival equation. Help those who share your genes, your offspring, your allies, and your future continues. Extend too far beyond that circle, and all may perish. Altruism in that context was triage, not philosophy. Compassion was rationed because it had to be. But the line between necessity and exclusion blurred easily. Over time, our selective kindness hardened into identity. The group became more than a collection of individuals. It became a living thing, with its own heartbeat, its own memory, its own immune system. And like any organism, it learned to protect itself. From disease, from scarcity, from others. That self-protection took many forms: suspicion, avoidance, even aggression. But it also took subtler, quieter forms: rituals of belonging, stories of origin, names and symbols that said, "This is who we are." These markers bound the group together, but they also created the first deep psychological divide between us and them. To belong was to be human. To stand outside was to be something less. And yet, paradoxically, these divisions were born from kindness itself, from the same instinct that made mothers share food, hunters share tools, elders share wisdom. Tribalism was empathy made efficient, an emotional algorithm that prioritized those most likely to sustain the whole. It was the system's way of surviving its own compassion. In that sense, our evolution was not toward cruelty, but toward complexity. Every act of care carried within it the shadow of exclusion. Every alliance drew a border, and each border demanded maintenance, through loyalty, through sacrifice, through stories of why our group, our way, our God, our truth mattered most. To be human was to be kind, but only to some. And yet that partial kindness, this deeply conditional love, was not a flaw. It was an adaptation. It kept us alive long enough to imagine something greater than ourselves. But it also left a question smouldering beneath the ashes of every tribe. If compassion saved us, what will it cost us when it turns inward too far? Because even as it stitched small groups together in unbreakable bonds, tribal compassion came with blind spots. The stronger the connection within, the harder it became to see the humanity beyond. And in a world of limited resources, that blindness wasn't merely tolerated, it was rewarded. When outsiders competed for food, territory, or mates, suspicion became prudence, fear became wisdom, dehumanization became strategy. But it didn't begin with violence. It began with stories. Stories that explained who we were and why our way was right. Stories that tethered kindness to identity. The earliest myths weren't written in books. They were spoken across generations, shaped by memory and repetition. And at the centre of those stories was often a simple idea. We are different, and because we are different, we are deserving. The other tribes, the ones across the river or beyond the ridge, they had their own stories, their own fires, their own kindness. But we could not see it. Evolution had not equipped us to. Instead, our minds became specialists in social calculus, tracking who could be trusted, who belonged, who owed what to whom. This worked beautifully inside the group, but outside, it became silence, or suspicion, or scapegoating. In this way, the machinery of cooperation, so intricate, so elegant, was never turned off. It simply turned inward, like a spiral. It wrapped around the familiar, feeding loyalty and protection, even as it withdrew from the unfamiliar. This is how empathy became exclusion, not through malice, but through prioritization. A kindness that worked too well, too locally. And yet, paradoxically, this same system also allowed us to survive in extreme environments, deserts, tundras, dense forests, places where no one could survive alone. Cooperation, for all its costs, was an evolutionary superpower. The tribes that coordinated better, that shared more efficiently, that punished freeloaders and remembered generosity, endured when others faded. The Ice Age was not just a test of physical endurance, it was a test of social architecture. Scarcity forged tighter bonds. Hunger forced innovation in food sharing. Cold taught us to huddle, not just for heat, but for hope. And in these crucibles, small communities evolved not merely to survive, but to feel deeply for one another, to suffer when one suffered, to grieve together, to heal together. This shared suffering was not weakness, it was cohesion, and it bred something else, sacrifice. One of the most remarkable traits of our species is the willingness to suffer for others, to give food to the old, to risk safety for the young, to carry burdens that are not ours. These acts, repeated again and again, generation after generation, became the glue of the human tribe, but the glue was strongest at the centre, and as the centre grew warmer, the edges grew colder. Those on the outside remained shadows, figures seen but not felt. Compassion did not vanish, it was simply rationed, and what the ration left out history would one day call cruelty. But it did not feel like cruelty to those within the circle. That's the unsettling truth. When kindness is concentrated, its absence elsewhere becomes invisible. The mind that has evolved to protect its group often cannot recognize the cost to others, not out of malice, but out of narrowing. It is a blindness of focus, not intention. We do not see the stranger's hunger if the child at our fire still weeps. This is what makes the kindness trap so difficult to escape, because it never announces itself as hostility. It arrives cloaked in tenderness, in care, in belonging, in the warm certainty that these are my people. And who could fault that? Who would not protect their child, their kin, their tribe when danger rises? Tribalism is not born from hatred. It is born from love. But love can be territorial. In evolutionary terms, this was adaptive, especially in times of stress, during famine, drought, or conflict. The group that could quickly distinguish between us and them had an edge. Suspicion became a form of pattern recognition. Outsiders were more likely to bring pathogens, more likely to compete for resources, more likely to disrupt delicate social balance. The brain, finely tuned to such threats, leaned toward caution. And caution, over time, ossified into prejudice. Even the architecture of the brain reveals this logic. Regions like the amygdala, the ancient alarm bell of the limbic system, are more reactive to faces labelled as out-group. even when those faces are neutral. Our bodies flinch before our thoughts do. The tribal line lives not just in ideology, but in physiology. And yet, the very same circuits that fuel exclusion are also capable of expansion. This is where the paradox returns again. The boundaries of empathy are not fixed. They are elastic. Under certain conditions, shared goals, shared enemies, interdependence, or even just repeated exposure, the line between us and them begins to blur. This is how alliances form, how neighbouring groups intermarry, how trust builds where once there was only avoidance. But that expansion comes at a cost. It requires effort, vulnerability, a willingness to not turn inward when fear rises. And in harsh environments, that willingness is rare. So instead, for most of prehistory, the logic of cooperation remained local. The firelight did not stretch far. It illuminated familiar faces, and beyond the flicker lay uncertainty. Still, inside that circle, something beautiful continued to unfold. The deeper the bonds, the more humans risked for one another. They invented fairness. They punished selfishness. They remembered debts and honoured them. They wept together, buried their dead together, laughed in the dark even when the wolves howled. This was not weakness. It was strength, a strength rooted in connection. But the same force that made that strength possible, the concentrating power of care, meant that those outside the circle were often left in the cold, literally and metaphorically. And that too was a survival strategy. But was it the only one? That's the question left echoing in the long corridor of our evolution. Because even as tribalism saved us, fed us, warmed us, gave us purpose, it also began to shape the limits of our moral imagination. In surviving together, we built the first blueprints for belonging. But with those blueprints came walls, and the walls were high. So we returned to the paradox. A species built for cooperation, yet divided by the very instincts that made that cooperation possible. Our capacity to love, to share, to nurture. It evolved not in spite of our tribalism, but because of it. And yet, every act of care bore the shadow of who was left out. This is the kindness trap. That the same brain that made us deeply social also made us deeply selective. We feel most for those nearest to us. We suffer when they suffer, and we leap to ease their pain. But that same urgency often goes numb at the margins. Our empathy, though powerful, fades with distance. And it's no accident. Evolution carved that gradient. In the Paleolithic night, when resources were scarce and every gesture carried weight, that fading empathy protected the group. It kept kindness efficient. But today, the world is larger than the circle around the fire. We are no longer just 10 or 20 in the cold. We are billions, interconnected, interdependent, facing challenges no single tribe can solve. So what becomes of our ancient design in a modern world? That question haunts the bones of every city, every nation, every border drawn not in sand but in mind. We still carry that firelight instinct, to care deeply for the familiar and to freeze the stranger out. But the threats we face now, climate, war, displacement, inequality, are not tribal. They are planetary. The survival of one depends increasingly on the survival of all, and here perhaps we glimpse a quiet hope. Because if the boundaries of empathy were shaped by environment, if the cold once narrowed our circle, then maybe a different world could widen it. Maybe the same neural architecture that once built walls can, under the right conditions, build bridges. Maybe the kindness trap isn't a prison, but a threshold. A doorway from which we can glimpse a wider belonging, if we choose to step through. But the choice is not easy. And evolution does not erase itself overnight. Our instincts remain. Ancient, beautiful, and deeply flawed. They whisper in our politics, our neighbourhoods, our fears, and sometimes they roar. Still, the fact that we can ask the question, is this circle wide enough, means something has already begun to shift. In the end, perhaps the most human act is not protecting the tribe. It is expanding the definition of who belongs. And if tribalism once saved us, then maybe, just maybe, the next great leap in our story will be learning to turn that same fierce devotion outward, not by abandoning the fire, but by carrying its warmth further than we ever have before. It is one thing to survive in a cold world, It is another to survive at the edge of extinction. Between 75 and 20,000 years ago, the Earth entered its deepest freeze, an era of bitter cold, staggering droughts, and ecological convulsions so extreme they reshaped the genetic blueprint of our species. Glaciers didn't just creep over continents, they conquered them. Rainforests shriveled, deserts expanded, great herds that once thundered across the grasslands vanished, replaced by silence and bone. This was not a winter of discontent, it was a winter without end. And for Homo sapiens, it came at the most vulnerable moment in our story. What does it mean to be fragile in the face of planetary force? To be soft-skinned, tool-bearing, memory-laden animals staring down ice that ground mountains into dust? It means being tested, not just in body, but in spirit. Because the Ice Age did not just demand warmth, it demanded trust. And yet, we almost did not make it. Somewhere around 70,000 years ago, the archaeological record begins to whisper something terrifying. Disappearance, populations crash, genetic diversity collapses. Across Asia and Africa, once thriving Homo sapiens groups vanish from the fossil map. Their campsites never rebuilt, their voices never echoed. What happened to them? Did they fall to the cold, to hunger, to one another? Or were they simply too dispersed, too fragile, too alone? The answer, etched faintly in the genome, lies in a concept known as the population bottleneck. Today, every human alive carries signs of that narrowing. Like a river squeezed through a canyon, our ancestry was funneled through a moment of breathtaking scarcity. Perhaps only a few thousand reproductive individuals remained. The diversity of all modern humans, our languages, our lineages, our bloodlines, sprang from this narrow root. Not a lush tree, but a twisted branch clawing through the snow. How does a species teeter on the brink and not fall? It does not come down to strength. Neanderthals were stronger, nor to endurance. Denisovans thrived in the high-altitude cold. Homo erectus endured for nearly 2 million years, but they are gone. We are not. Why? To understand that, you must picture not the vast migrations or grand discoveries, but the smallest, simplest act. One person sharing food with another, not because they had to, because they chose to, because they believed, even in the frostbitten dark, that the survival of the whole was worth more than the hoarding of the few. Is it possible that what saved us was not fire, not flint, not fur, but trust? The Ice Age was a crucible, and it did not test our intelligence in isolation. It tested our bonds. What happens to a mind shaped by a group, when the group is all that stands between life and oblivion? What happens to loyalty, to sacrifice, to love, when even a small betrayal could mean the death of many? And what kind of creature walks out of that storm, changed not just in body, but in soul? To understand the crucible our ancestors passed through, we must first imagine its scale. This was not a single cold spell, nor a gradual dip in temperature. It was a chaotic dance of ice and fire, of glacial advance and retreat, driven by orbital cycles and abrupt climate events. Across vast spans of time, landscapes changed faster than life could adapt. A fertile plain could become tundra in a generation. Rivers dried up, forests collapsed. Species blinked out of existence not one by one, but by the dozens. And in the middle of it all, small bands of Homo sapiens, scattered and struggling, pushed to the margins of what was survivable. These weren't kingdoms or empires. These were tiny, intimate collectives, perhaps 20, maybe 40 individuals, bound not by law but by memory. They knew each other's faces, each other's stories. In that kind of world, cooperation wasn't a virtue. It was breath, but cooperation alone wasn't enough. The environment demanded something deeper, something more radical. It demanded trust. Because trust is what allows you to share when you have almost nothing. Trust is what allows you to close your eyes by the fire and know someone will keep watch. Trust is what lets a hunter take the longer, more dangerous path, not for glory, but because the child back in camp needs meat. Without it, the cold wins. These high-trust micro-societies operated not on hierarchy, but on reciprocity. There were no rulers in the Ice Age, only those who remembered, who gave, and who could be counted on. In such groups, every gesture mattered. Every decision left a wake. There was no anonymity, no escape from your actions. If you failed the group failed you. And so, something astonishing began to evolve. Not just behaviours, but emotions tailored for survival in scarcity. Guilt, shame, gratitude, generosity. These were not moral teachings handed down from gods. They were adaptations, honed in the frost. Even fairness, so often treated as a lofty ideal, may have its roots here. In conditions of extreme deprivation, unfairness could unravel the entire web of trust. The hoarder, the liar, the one who ate more than their share, they weren't just selfish, they were dangerous. Evolution favoured those who punished them, who remembered their misdeeds, who warned others. In this way, the group became not just a refuge, but an organism of its own, self-correcting, emotionally bonded, alert to betrayal. And slowly, over thousands of frozen nights, we became a species whose survival hinged not on the individual, but the interdependent whole. This is the part of our ancestry often overlooked. Not the tools, not the hunts, but the feeling of someone leaning into you for warmth and you letting them. Not because it helped you live, but because it helped us live. That word, us, became sacred long before any religion carved it into stone. It emerged in the silence between storms, in the hush of breath shared between bodies wrapped in fur and fear. Us was the fire, the meat, the safety. It was the line between warmth and waste, between being buried and being remembered, and it was always fragile. Trust may have been the secret weapon of our survival, but it was also endlessly vulnerable to fracture. One broken promise, one stolen share, one outburst of selfishness could unravel the invisible thread that held a group together. And so our ancestors evolved to become exquisitely sensitive to social cues, the sideways glance, the withheld offering, the story retold with just a little less generosity. Even today, modern humans show a remarkable capacity to detect cheaters, to track social debts, to favour those who give and exclude those who take. This is not a flaw, it is an echo, a neurochemical signature from a world where every meal was a vote of confidence in someone else's goodwill. But this trust had a shadow, because if survival required deep loyalty, it also required deep exclusion. Not everyone could be included, not everyone could be helped. When the band only had enough food for 20, the 21st was a threat, not because of malice, but because of math. And so the edge of the Ice Age became not just a physical boundary, but a moral one. Inside the group, empathy could be limitless, but outside it evaporated. This wasn't evil. It was efficient. Still, the pressure forged more than just fear. In some rare cases, it also birthed innovation. And not just technological innovation, like better blades or warmer clothing, but social innovation. The kinds of systems that allowed more people to share more safely, to reduce the risks of betrayal, to bind members tighter even in the face of growing need. There is evidence, faint but provocative, that ritual behaviour intensified during these glacial centuries. Not just burials and body paint, but shared ceremonies, offerings, chants, symbolic gestures that reinforced group identity. These weren't just spiritual experiments, they were glue. Ritual made belonging feel tangible, it gave shape to loyalty. It reminded every member of who we are when survival demanded a reason to trust beyond the next meal. The irony is that the cold, which threatened to extinguish us, may have also intensified what made us human. It made our social world more intimate, more sacred, more necessary. And in doing so, it quietly sculpted the emotional palette we still carry. Loyalty, suspicion, guilt, sacrifice, and the aching joy of being seen and accepted. That is the soul forged at the ice's edge, not in triumph, but in trembling connection. And beneath all of it, the genome tells the same tale. A narrowing, a survival, a resilience built not on domination, but on devotion. Still, even devotion had its limits. The world our ancestors faced during the last glacial maximum, between 26 and 20,000 years ago, was perhaps the most hostile it had ever been. Sea levels dropped by over 100 metres, exposing jagged coastlines and icy steppes. Gigantic glaciers crept southward, swallowing the northern continents in silence. Even the equatorial belts, long thought stable, suffered collapse. Monsoons failed, wetlands dried. In many regions, edible plants and game animals disappeared for generations. For Homo sapiens, this was not just a test of cooperation, it was a test of imagination. When the world shrinks, when known routes vanish under snow, when neighbouring bands disappear without word or trace, what keeps a group from turning inward so tightly that it collapses? What prevents trust from curdling into fear, generosity into suspicion? The answer, perhaps surprisingly, lies not in brute adaptability but in narrative. Across scattered archaeological sites, blades buried beside bones, ochre-stained walls lit by flickering torchlight, we see something strange begin to appear. The marks of continuity, stories, symbols, evidence that even in the coldest nights, humans were telling each other who they were and why they mattered. This was not ornament, it was medicine. Because narrative is not just entertainment, it is a binding agent for trust. In conditions where resources could not be relied upon, stories were. They reminded people of the reasons to stay loyal. They taught caution, shared wisdom, marked heroes, warned against betrayal. They elevated group survival into moral drama, and in doing so made sacrifice sacred. Imagine the scene. A small shelter, fur-lined and fire-warmed, huddled in a storm that has lasted for days. There is little to eat, the children are coughing, and in the quiet someone begins to speak, not to complain, but to remember. The ancestors who crossed the ice, the woman who gave her share to save a newborn, the time the mammoth was brought down by cunning and courage. The stories were not distractions from the cold, they were shields against despair, and just as importantly they were frameworks for justice, because in high-trust micro-societies justice could not be abstract. It had to be lived, remembered, reinforced. Those who harmed the group were not just punished, they were storied, named, remembered, their betrayal woven into the law as a warning. Likewise, acts of courage and care became myths, handed down not for ego, but for education. This is the slow evolution of morality, not as decree, but as collective memory. The harshness of the world did not break these groups. It honed them. It forced them to see each other clearly, to depend not just on flesh and blood, but on shared meaning. In this way, the cold became something more than a threat. It became a teacher, one that whispered, "You will not survive alone. You must become more than yourself." And somehow, against the coldest odds, we did. From the edge of annihilation, our species did not just endure. We changed. Not in body, though there were adaptations to be sure. Shorter limbs in colder climates, stockier builds to retain heat. But more profoundly, we changed in how we belong to one another. We emerged from the bottleneck not just as survivors of nature, but as survivors of our own limitations. The Ice Age demanded from us not strength, not speed, not clever tools, but loyalty, empathy, imagination, and trust under pressure. In those long glacial centuries, the shape of the human mind was carved as much by the absence of food as by the presence of others. This is perhaps the most haunting legacy of the ice's razor edge, that our emotional blueprint, the systems that guide how we love, how we fear, how we remember and protect, was forged not in peace, but in peril. And the evidence lives on not just in ancient bones or fire-scorched stones, but in every act of kindness offered under duress, in every group that chooses to share in scarcity, in every story that turns survival into meaning. Genetically, the mark remains. All humans today carry signs of that near miss, that squeeze through evolutionary darkness. The loss of diversity in our mitochondrial DNA tells us how close we came. It is as if, for a moment, the entire future of our species flickered inside a single campfire's glow, a few hundred people, perhaps less, holding fast while the winds howled across a dying landscape. They did not know they were saving the future. They only knew they were saving each other. That is the paradox of our origins. We are here because they trusted. And yet, in trusting, they laid the groundwork for all the divisions that would follow, because what bound their group so tightly would later make us wary of strangers. What made us sacred made them suspect. What preserved belonging in one place set the stage for exclusion in another. Still, there is a quiet kind of hope in this story. Because it means that the instincts we so often think of as flaws, our hunger for connection, our fear of betrayal, our deep need for fairness, are not signs of weakness. They are memories. Frozen memories, thawed and inherited. Tools shaped in ice, handed down in blood. And so, when we struggle today with the complexity of living together, when empathy falters, when trust fractures, we are not broken. We are ancient. We are creatures still learning to expand the warmth of the firelit circle beyond the cold walls we once needed. The Ice Age is over, but its lessons are not. They live in us still, soft-skinned, story-bound, tribal by nature, searching always for ways to survive together. Not by outrunning the cold, but by becoming again and again a shelter from it. To survive is not always a triumph. Sometimes it is a riddle, a haunting, half-answered question that echoes across time. Why us? Why are we here and not them? Because we were not alone. For most of our history, far longer than we've walked the earth alone, we lived among others who looked like us, walked like us, thought perhaps not so differently, the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, the shadowy fragments of other archaic cousins whose names we may never know. They were not myths, they were not beasts, they were human, and yet they are gone. Their bones lie beneath the sediment, weathered and incomplete. Their tools, once held in familiar hands, now sit in silent museums. No stories remain, no names, only echoes in our blood. Because their story did not vanish entirely, it folded into ours. What does it mean that we carry their DNA? That fragments of Neanderthal code live in the skin and immune systems of billions of us today? That Denisovan traces thread through the lungs of Tibetans and the blood of Pacific Islanders? These are not ancient memories. They are living inheritances. They whisper of contact, of closeness, of interbreeding across boundaries we once imagined were fixed. So who were they, these others? Neanderthals, stockier, robust, deeply adapted to the cold. A species born into European winters, with larger eyes, broader noses, and brains slightly larger than ours. They made tools, they buried their dead, they may have painted caves, they endured for over 400,000 years. The Denisovans remain more spectral. Known from a single finger bone, a few teeth, and the astonishing revelations of ancient DNA, they haunt the eastern highlands of Asia like a half-sketched ghost. Fewer fossils, more mystery. Yet their genes are written into the bodies of those who live in the shadows of the Himalayas and the islands of Melanesia. And there were others still. The Red Deer Cave people of China, Homo floresiensis, the hobbits of Indonesia, Homo naledi in South Africa. Human enough to bury their dead in darkness, to shape tools, to shelter from the storm. So what happened? Did we outcompete them? Did our tools grow sharper, our strategies more efficient, our alliances stronger? Or did we absorb them, slowly, imperceptibly, like a tide swelling over an older shore? Or was it darker than that? Did we push them out, drive them into marginal lands, then watch as their numbers dwindled in silence? Did we fear their difference more than we embraced our shared ancestry? What happens when one kind of human draws a line in the snow and says, "This is ours"? And what kind of boundary is drawn between us and them when them is still almost entirely us? Because that is the uncomfortable truth of our evolutionary story. The border between Homo sapiens and the other humans was never clean. It was porous, fuzzy, flickering like heat above a fire. The idea that we were distinct, pure, or fundamentally different only arrives much later, long after the bones have settled. Back then, the difference may have been little more than an accent in the voice, a nuance in gesture, a shape of the brow. To meet a Neanderthal in the forest was perhaps not like meeting an animal. It may have been like meeting a stranger from another village, familiar, but not quite kin. And still, we touched. The science of ancient DNA has made that clear. Interbreeding did not happen once, or in one place. It happened multiple times, in different regions, over tens of thousands of years. And it wasn't limited to Neanderthals. Denisovan DNA is found in peoples as far apart as Siberia and Papua New Guinea. Somewhere, somehow, a human stood before another human and chose closeness, not fear. But interbreeding does not mean equality. We do not know how these encounters began. We do not know whether they were peaceful, mutual, coerced, or desperate. The archaeological record, like the Ice Age itself, preserves only fragments: a tooth, a femur, a gene, and yet those fragments tell us something important. We did not remain separate. So why did we persist? It's possible the answer lies not in biology, but in behaviour, in social plasticity, in the speed and flexibility of cultural transmission. Where Neanderthal groups may have lived in small, isolated clusters, genetic evidence suggests they were highly inbred. Homo sapiens seem to spread ideas more rapidly, across broader territories. Symbols moved, tools moved, people moved. Information flowed between bands like a nervous system pulsing across continents. This agility of culture, this ability to take in new ideas and make them feel ancient, may have been our species' decisive edge. And yet, it raises a more haunting possibility. What if it wasn't superiority that led to extinction, but scale? What if we simply overwhelmed them, not by intention, not by conquest, but by numbers, by spreading faster, reproducing more, filling landscapes with our fires and footsteps until there was simply no more room left in the margins? What if our story is not one of a noble triumph, but of quiet displacement, of being too good at surviving? Because when space runs out, when winters drag on, when strangers become mouths to feed rather than hands to help, the lines drawn in the snow begin to harden, and a tribal boundary becomes not just a line of belonging, but a line of severance. And once it is drawn, once the mind has learned to sort the world into those like us and those who are not, a subtle shift takes root in the psyche. The warmth we feel for those inside the circle begins to mirror itself as caution, even coldness, toward those outside it. This was not malice. It was a mechanism. In a world as fragile as the Ice Age, trust was currency, and cohesion meant survival. Any outsider posed risk of disease, of betrayal, of competition for scarce game and shelter. The cost of misplaced generosity could be fatal, so the tribal boundary evolved not just as a marker of kinship, but as a filter for empathy. We mourned those within the circle, we protected them, we shared with them, we sang for them. But those outside, they became shadows, a blur at the edge of the firelight. This tension between union and exclusion is perhaps the most defining feature of tribalism. It gives and it withholds, it nurtures and it defends. And in the story of the other humans, we see how powerfully this boundary can shape fate, because there are hints, scattered like bone fragments in the soil, that we did not always keep our distance. Some burial sites show mixed traits, skulls with both Neanderthal robustness and Sapiens delicacy. Some toolkits blend technologies. Some cave paintings bear gestures familiar to both. But they are exceptions. The more common pattern is one of divergence, of two human worlds occupying overlapping space, but increasingly separate paths. As Homo sapiens spread through Europe and Asia, Neanderthal populations shrank, their habitats fractured. Denisovans, never as widespread to begin with, seemed to fade even earlier, retreating into genetic whispers. This fading was not immediate. It took thousands of years, but it was unrelenting. And as it happened, something irreversible unfolded, not just in biology but in memory. Because the dead cannot speak for themselves. Their stories are carried or they vanish. And as the last Neanderthal fell silent, as the last Denisovan child grew old in a shrinking band, the stories of their people began to evaporate, and we did not keep them. We did not, it seems, carve their names into stone. We did not weave their songs into ours. Whatever tales they told beneath their own stars, whatever rituals they held in the dusk, those tapestries were not passed on. Instead, we filled the silence with our own myths, stories of uniqueness, of chosenness, of being the sole heirs of the world. But the truth is older than our myths. We were never alone. We are not the beginning of the human story. We are its last chapter, one written atop many others, whose ink has long since faded from the page. And yet the echoes remain, in our bones, in our blood, in the curve of a skull, or the resilience of an immune cell passed down through Denisovan hands. The past is never fully buried, not when it still walks beside us in the form of our inheritance. And this, perhaps, is where the story turns from elegy to reckoning. Because if we are the ones who endured, if we carry the legacy of all the others, then we are not just the survivors. We are the stewards of remembrance. To be the last human species is not only a biological fact, it is a moral inheritance. It means we bear the memory of those we outlasted. The Neanderthals, with their broad faces and quiet genius. The Denisovans, hidden in mountain shadows. The Red Deer Cave people, whose hybrid forms still puzzle paleoanthropologists. And those whose names we do not know, whose bones remain unnamed, whose DNA we have not yet read, whose tools lie buried beneath the weight of time. We live in a world where only one humankind remains, but we did not start that way, and it is not inevitable that it ended this way. Anthropologists speak now of a leaky replacement, a model that imagines not a conquest but a slow merging, not a clean extinction but a blurring. We did not exterminate our cousins in one single act. Rather, the boundary dissolved through centuries of proximity, through contact and conflict and curiosity, through the silent logic of time. And still, something was lost. Because genetic inheritance is not cultural memory. DNA carries no songs. It does not recall the way a Denisovan might have braided their child's hair, or what kind of lullabies echoed in a Neanderthal cave. It remembers chemistry, not poetry. To carry their genes is not the same as remembering them, and so we face a question, one that stretches not just backward in time but forward. If we are the last humans, what kind of ancestors will we be? Will we repeat the forgetting? Will we build walls in place of bridges? Will we teach our children to fear what is almost us? Because the boundary between us and them was never fixed. It has always been drawn in the dust, redrawn with each footstep, softened by each shared fire. And perhaps, once, long ago, it dissolved completely. Two kinds of humans. One night. A fire crackling in the dark. A gesture of peace. A name exchanged. A child born. And so the story changes. Not a conquest, not a tragedy, but a convergence. And that convergence, fragile, partial, incomplete, is still with us now, in our faces, in our cells, in the unfinished sentence of who we are. Because the story of the other humans did not end. It was never meant to be a closed chapter, sealed away beneath layers of glacial dust. Instead, it lives on, as tension, as memory, as questions we still don't know how to ask. What does it mean to be the only ones left? To walk a world once shared? To carry in our very biology the breath of those who vanished, even as we struggle to remember their names? Their voices are not gone, not entirely. They whisper from our genomes, from our inherited immune systems, from the shape of our fingertips and the depth of our sleep cycles. Denisovan genes help modern Tibetans breathe at high altitudes. Neanderthal alleles influence skin tone, pain sensitivity, and the way we process infections. But more than that, they remain as moral presences, ghosts in the human psyche. Because they were not monsters, nor myths, nor simple savages. They were humans. They buried their dead. They may have adorned their bodies, painted their shelters, sung into the night. Their eyes saw the same stars. Their children laughed. Their elders wept. They looked into firelight and wondered. And that is the real weight of tribalism, not just in how it protects, but in what it excludes. In the harsh conditions of the Ice Age, exclusion may have been necessary. It may have been the only way to preserve the fragile coherence of a group. Trust could not be extended without risk. Generosity could not be infinite. But this logic, once adaptive, did not end with the glaciers. It travelled forward. We inherited the boundary. We inherited the instinct to draw the circle of us small enough to manage, and to fear what lies outside it. But we also inherited the moments of crossing, those rare but radiant instances when two groups met, not with spears, but with open hands, when stories were exchanged instead of accusations, when the boundary bent and allowed a new kind of future to emerge. What happened to the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and the others is still, in part, a mystery. But what happens next? How we carry that legacy, how we understand what it means to be human in a world once filled with many kinds of humans, that part is not written yet. And so the fire continues to burn. Not just as warmth, but as memory. Not just as memory, but as invitation. To imagine that every person you see carries, however faintly, the legacy of many vanished peoples. To imagine that our survival was never a solitary victory, but the unfolding of something larger, stranger, more interconnected than we know. And in the flickering light of that understanding, the line between us and them may begin, at last, to blur. What if the most powerful tool ever forged by human hands was not a tool at all? Not fire, not flint, not the spear or the loom or the needle, but something quieter, something invisible, something that leaves no trace in the fossil record, yet reshaped the world more profoundly than any artifact. What if our real invention, the one that set us apart, that allowed us to survive the freezing winds of the Pleistocene and the long starvation of lean seasons, was each other? Imagine the camp dim in the early twilight, ash from last night's fire still warm. A child too young to walk is handed from one set of arms to another, not only from mother to father, but to aunt, cousin, elder, neighbour. The baby does not cry. It knows these hands. It trusts them. Why? Because this, more than any stone flake or sharpened point, is the quiet revolution. Alloparenting, shared childcare. A mother could leave to forage, to hunt, to rest, because others would protect and nourish her child. And in doing so, a vast trust network began to grow, a net of interdependence strung from heart to heart across the clan. What kind of mind does this require? Not merely memory or logic or perception, but something more intricate. A mental map not of places or prey, but of people. Who is bonded to whom? Who is safe? Who is struggling? What does that look mean? That silence, that pause? In these questions, the human brain began to swell. The neocortex bloomed like a forest after rain, not to calculate angles of spear throwing, but to model the shifting weather systems of emotion and allegiance. And with it came a strange recursive magic. Cooperation built minds that were better at cooperating. Shared care led to shared thought. One person noticed a pattern in the stars. Another remembered the season when roots were sweetest. A third knew how to twist fibre into cord. None knew everything, but together they knew more than anyone ever could alone. Is this not a kind of collective intelligence? Not the individual genius of a singular mind, but the communal genius of many minds, overlapping, correcting, remembering, adapting. Knowledge passed not just down generations, but sideways across kin, woven into gesture, mimicry, and murmured stories. What was known by one could become known by all. No creature before us had achieved this. Not like this. Not at this scale. And so the real leap in human evolution was not the making of things, but the making of one another. A society where the group, not the individual, was the engine of innovation. But how far can such trust stretch? How do you scale intimacy? When the brain is evolved for faces you recognize and voices you've heard since birth, what happens when the tribe grows too large, too scattered, too abstract? What invisible thread keeps the net from tearing? Anthropologists have a name for what eventually held it all together: ultrasociality. It is a rare thing in nature. Most animals cooperate only when necessary. Some mammals share parenting. Some birds migrate in flocks. Ants and bees build collective colonies, ruled by instinct and chemical signals. But humans evolved something different. A social structure that was flexible, learned, scalable, and open-ended. We didn't just bond as families. We created roles, rules, and rituals to bind strangers into functioning tribes. This is the real miracle of our species. Not just that we cooperate, but that we've made cooperation into an art form. That we've turned invisible expectations into binding contracts, so that a hunter knows his kill will be shared, so that an elder's knowledge will be honoured, so that a mother's child will be fed even if she dies. Ultrasociality is not just living together. It is coordinating action on a level so intricate, so precise, that the group begins to behave as a single organism, a supermind made of many minds. Everyone doesn't do the same thing. In fact, it works because we don't. One person crafts stone blades, another gathers tubers, another cares for children, another watches the horizon, a fifth remembers the old ways. This is division of labour, and it's as fundamental to our survival as breathing. And when division of labour becomes habitual, something else begins to stir. Dependency. I don't know how to do what you do. You don't know how to do what I do, but together we make a world. That dependency demands communication, not only about what must be done, but about who we are. You must know that I will do my part. I must know you will do yours. Trust is not a luxury here. It is the substrate of existence, and so we developed subtle tools, not of wood or stone, but of mind. Facial expressions that can warn or soothe in an instant. Postures that convey status without violence, words that bind intentions into promises, and behind it all, the unspoken sense, I see you, I rely on you. We are not the same, but we are one. Ultrasociality turned the human group into a breathing, learning, evolving organism, and this organism had memory, not locked in a single skull, but shared across the collective. When someone died, their knowledge could outlive them, echoed in the mouths of others. When someone learned something new, it could ripple outward, touching the whole clan. No other species had this kind of cultural memory. We were building something, not a structure of stone, but of shared meaning, a knowledge web, a tribe of minds. But this structure was fragile. For every bond it created, it demanded attention, emotion, commitment. It worked beautifully when small and tight-knit. But what would happen when the tribe grew? When memory frayed and roles multiplied? How do you maintain a superorganism without losing the soul of it? The answer, in part, was culture, not just as music, dance, or myth, but as an adaptive technology, honed over tens of thousands of years, designed to preserve the wisdom of the past without demanding that every individual relearn it from scratch. Culture is memory, externalized. It lives in ritual and rhythm, in stories passed down by firelight, in gestures repeated until they become instinct. It allows knowledge to accumulate, like sediment in a riverbed. One generation learns to twist sinew into rope, the next binds it tighter, the third invents the knot. Without culture, every mind starts from zero. With it, a child can begin where an ancestor left off. And it is here, perhaps more than anywhere else, that human ultrasociality reveals its hidden genius, not just in cooperation, but in transmission. In the sharing of knowledge not as a transaction, but as a gift freely given, bound to identity, obligation, and belonging. In the Paleolithic world, survival knowledge wasn't written down. It was embodied through movement, ritual, and repeated observation. A girl didn't learn to gather edible roots from a diagram. She learned by watching her aunt, by tasting, by touching, by returning year after year to the same patch of ground. A boy didn't learn to shape a blade from instructions. He learned from the rhythm of hands beside his own, from the quiet corrections of a teacher who didn't speak in commands, but in demonstration. And here again, trust is the thread, because to transmit knowledge requires vulnerability. It requires the teacher to slow down, the learner to admit ignorance, the group to believe that what is old may still be wise, and that what is young may still be worth teaching. This is not just biology, it is a social contract, and that contract is enforced not by violence or law, but by belonging. If you are part of us, we teach you. If you learn, you remain one of us. It is this subtle reciprocity, learning as bonding, that allowed human groups to build vast knowledge webs, not centralized, but distributed. Each member held a piece of the whole. One knew which mushrooms were safe, another knew the migration patterns of animals, another could imitate birdsong to lure prey. Alone they were vulnerable. Together they were a living library. This is what allowed humans to adapt to every corner of the earth. We didn't just adapt through mutation, we adapted through imitation. It is faster than genes, more flexible than instinct, and it allows cumulative change, a true rarity in the animal kingdom. The world changed. We remembered. The seasons shifted. We adjusted. Our tools improved not by random chance, but by the slow layering of insight across time. And so, with no cities, no scripts, no machines, we became civilizations in miniature, held together by ritual, by rhythm, and by the soft strength of shared minds. But even the strongest net can unravel. What happens when the group grows too large? When people who once shared daily life now live days apart? When not everyone knows each other's face, or voice, or scent? This is the paradox of success. The very ultra-sociality that allowed small bands to thrive also planted the seed of something more dangerous, the strain of scale. Because human trust evolved in intimacy. It evolved for circles of kin, for eye contact and shared meals, for alliances sealed not in documents but in memory. In Paleolithic terms, the average human community numbered no more than a few dozen, a tribe where everyone's story was known. But as cultural knowledge multiplied, as our web of cooperation deepened, the cost of separation decreased. You could now survive among strangers as long as they knew the rules, as long as they believed in the same rituals, the same songs, the same invisible boundaries. This was not instinct, it was invention, a new kind of adaptation, and it gave rise to something breathtaking, the abstract tribe. You didn't have to know someone to trust them, only to know that they belonged to your tribe, that they bore the same marks, the same customs, the same gods. Symbol became surrogate for intimacy. Paint on skin, beads around the neck, a chant, a scar, a scent. Any of these could signal group membership in a world too vast for familiarity. This symbolic communication wasn't decoration. It was infrastructure. It allowed us to grow. It allowed the scattered web of hunter-gatherer clans to stretch across landscapes, trading tools, genes, and stories with others they had never met, because trust had become portable, because identity had become visible. But with this came a quiet shift. Rules. Not just the fluid expectations of daily cooperation, but codified customs. What we wear, how we speak, who we may marry, what we may eat. These began as signals but soon became boundaries, and boundaries as always have edges. Inside the boundary, safety, obligation, support. Outside the boundary, danger, suspicion, and sometimes opportunity. Because this was also the moment when knowledge itself became strategic, when sharing a technique, a recipe, or a route might help your group or help your rivals. The web that had once connected the tribe as a single mind now began to split, not into chaos, but into nested minds, group identities, intertribal politics, alliances, betrayals. Human cooperation had grown too big to hold in one brain, so we invented a new kind of brain, the social narrative. We began to tell stories of who we were, where we came from, who we could trust, who we must fear. These stories became memory, they became lore, they became myth. And myths are sticky. They remember longer than we do. They shape how we act long after we've forgotten why. But stories can also bridge the divide. In their most generous form, they stretch the tribe outward. They imagine kinship where there is no blood. They let strangers become allies, allies become friends, and friends become something more. Co-authors in the great narrative of survival. A story that says, you belong, you are one of us. This is where the real power of human cooperation lies, not only in transmitting knowledge, but in expanding identity. We are not only the species that remembers, we are the species that includes. It is easy to miss how strange this is. Other animals form groups, but they do not reweave the borders of those groups by shared belief, by symbol, by tale. Chimpanzees may mourn the dead or console the injured, but they do not imagine a common ancestor beyond their troop. Wolves cooperate, but they do not pass on fables to smooth over conflict. Elephants remember, but they do not build myths to unite generations. Humans do, and those myths, those shared dreams, became the glue for something new. Not just the family, not just the clan, but culture as a living organism fed by minds, shaped by language, passed down through time like a flame protected in cupped hands. We became not just survivors, but stewards. Stewards of each other's knowledge, stewards of memory, stewards of the unbroken thread that stretched back through ice and dark and firelit cave. A thread woven not of stone but of trust. That is the secret technology. Not spears, not snares, not even language in isolation, but the whole lattice of interwoven roles, rituals and relationships that made the human group not just a collection of individuals, but an engine of adaptation. And like all great technologies, it had unintended consequences. The very trust that bound us could blind us. The very stories that stitched us together could separate us from others. The same ultra-social mind that cooperates in profound generosity can also draw sharp, invisible lines between us and them, between the safe and the suspicious, between those we care for instinctively and those we can turn away from without guilt. In that tension, Between inclusion and exclusion, between empathy and boundary, lies the deep, complex legacy of our most powerful invention. But perhaps that tension was never meant to be resolved. Perhaps the miracle is not that we built tribes, but that we made them flexible, that we could redraw the lines, expand the circle, teach and learn and change. Because what saved us was not strength. It was not speed or cunning or fire. It was each other. We made a world of minds, and in that world we discovered that the truest shelter in the long winter night was not a cave, or a coat, or a tool. It was a hand extended, a story shared, a name spoken with care. The warmth of the tribe is undeniable, but every fire casts a shadow. For thousands of years that fire kept us alive, kept our children warm, kept stories burning through the frost, kept hands extended in the quiet code of mutual care. And yet there is something else in the glow, something harder to name. It is the way we draw the circle. Not only to include, but to define who stands outside it. What happens when the instinct to belong becomes the instinct to divide? To understand that question, we must begin not with hatred, but with love. Love, in the evolutionary sense, is selective. It begins with kin, with the infant's helpless cry answered by a parent's sacrifice, with blood ties, with faces we know. It makes survival possible, but not for everyone. Our ancestors did not evolve in a vacuum of equal care. They evolved in dense forests and open tundra, where resources ran thin, and death favoured those who helped their own. The rules were simple, and they were written not in laws but in impulses. Protect your group, share with your kin, defend the boundary. And so we became creatures of in-group favouritism. Even in infancy, humans begin to prefer familiar faces, voices, even scents. We mimic those around us, not only to learn, but to signal that we belong. Long before words like tribe or nation or race were invented, our brains were already calculating closeness. Not just emotional closeness, but proximity of identity. Who is one of us, and who is not? But evolution writes its scripts with indifference. It doesn't care whether favouritism leads to kindness or cruelty, only that it increases the odds of replication. And in the deep Ice Age past, favouritism did just that. It created circles of trust. It created alliances that could endure hunger, predators, and winter storms. It created units so tightly bound that they moved like a single organism. The tribe became a living thing, and the individual became a cell within it. And when the stakes are that high, exclusion becomes a form of self-defense. Prejudice in this light is not always born from malice. It is often born from fear, the unknown, the unfamiliar, the other camp, the stranger's face. These were not abstract concepts, they were possible threats to the fragile harmony of the group. Even a whisper of difference could mean danger. But what happens when fear becomes habitual? When the brain begins to conflate unfamiliarity with moral inferiority? When the boundary once meant to protect becomes a wall that blinds? Because the same circuitry that grants us love also grants us permission to look away, to ignore, to justify, to dehumanize. And in that small turn of thought, in that microsecond where empathy is withheld, the shadow of belonging begins to stretch. It moves silently across the snow, carried in language, in laughter, in law, and no one sees it at first, until it is too wide to cross. This is the paradox of tribalism, not that it leads to hatred, but that it does so quietly, incrementally, through the very mechanisms that once made us strong, that made us safe, that made us human. Because belonging is not passive, it is cultivated, reinforced, ritualized, and like any precious thing, it must be guarded, especially in a world where danger once lurked in every shadow. Our ancestors learned to protect what they loved, but love can harden. It can become rigid, especially when it is encoded in myth. Think of the stories told around Paleolithic fires, the creation myths, the tales of ancestors and heroes, the warnings passed from mouth to mouth like sacred flame. These were not only entertainment, they were architecture. They shaped group identity, drawing lines between who we are and who we are not. These stories weren't just about the past, they prescribed the future. They said, this is how we live, this is what we do, this is who we trust, and inevitably, this is who we don't. Because stories are more than memory. They are filters. They help us sort the world into meaningful patterns, but they also carry assumptions, judgments, fears. In every mythology, there is a villain. In every tribe, a cautionary tale. In-group identity begins with shared belief, but those beliefs often include shared suspicion of the outsider, the wanderer, the other gods, the other customs, the other ways of being. Anthropologists have found this pattern in nearly every traditional society ever studied, whether in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, the Arctic tundra, or the Sahelian plains. The tribe defines itself as much by its own practices as by its distance from others, what we eat, what we wear, how we bury our dead. These become moral boundaries, not just cultural ones. To step outside them is not simply difference, it is deviance. And when survival is at stake, deviance becomes dangerous. So we defend the boundary not just with rules, but with emotion, with pride, with shame, with ridicule and reverence. And at the centre of it all is a strange double current in the human mind, the capacity to feel immense tenderness for the in-group and cold indifference, or even violence, toward the out-group. This duality is not a flaw, it is an adaptation. It is the psychological cost of ultra-sociality. To love some deeply, we often turn away from others entirely. And it is this wiring that allowed tribes to risk everything for one another. To fight, to bleed, to starve so that a child might live, to stand unflinching at the edge of death for the sake of a familiar face. It is also what allowed us to kill without hesitation, to raid, to enslave, to erase, not because humans are monsters, but because monsters too can wear the mask of loyalty. In the Ice Age world, there was no Geneva Convention, no universal declaration of human rights. There were only the immediate demands of survival, and the social technologies that made that survival possible. What mattered most was trust. Trust within the group. Trust that the person beside you would share the meat, keep the fire, guard your child when your back was turned. But trust has a price. To maintain it, you must exclude those who might break it. You must identify them, mark them, often before they've done anything at all. The capacity for cruelty, then, is not a failure of the social brain. It is a byproduct of its design. Neuroscience shows that the same circuits responsible for empathy light up most strongly when we see someone from our own group in pain. But those circuits grow dimmer, sometimes shockingly so, when the person is from an outgroup. It's not that we choose to care less. It's that our brains never offer us the signal in the first place. This too is ancient. It is why warfare could exist long before nations, why revenge killings occurred between neighbouring clans in pre-agricultural societies, why even peaceful bands maintain deep suspicion toward outsiders. The circle of moral concern was never universal by default. It was local, earned, familiar. And within that circle, we were magnificent. Shared meals, communal child-rearing, elder care, coordinated hunts, protective mourning. The Paleolithic world was laced with moments of astonishing tenderness, a kind of intimacy many of us in the modern world no longer experience. Each person mattered, every voice counted. Bonds were not abstract, they were visceral. But outside the circle, there was a different kind of logic. Not necessarily hatred, but distance, coldness, a soft shrug, a belief that they are not quite like us, that their suffering does not carry the same moral weight. This is what psychologists now call parochial altruism, the idea that love for the in-group can evolve alongside aggression toward the out-group. The stronger the in-group bond, the more justified the hostility may seem, and it's not just ancient history. You can see this dynamic today in football rivalries in political factions, in the lines drawn between neighbourhoods, nations, identities. We inherit the same neural architecture, the same need to belong, the same flicker of suspicion when faced with unfamiliar customs, clothes, accents, or gods. It does not make us evil, but it does make us vulnerable. Vulnerable to stories that exploit our wiring, that promise safety by narrowing our circle of care, that tell us who deserves our loyalty and who doesn't. Because once you believe someone is not quite human, it becomes easier to look away, to turn your back, to walk past, even if they are shivering, even if they are hungry, even if they are just alone. The tribe teaches us who to help, but it also teaches us who not to see. In the Ice Age, that blindness may have had utility. In a world of extreme scarcity, it was not sustainable to feed everyone. Altruism, when stretched too far, could break the delicate equilibrium of a group's survival. So the mind evolved its guardrails. Empathy distributed not equally but selectively. And yet, there were exceptions. Moments when the boundary blurred. Burials of disabled individuals. Elderly people who had long ceased to contribute physically, yet were cared for until the end. These anomalies, found in the archaeological record, challenge the purely functionalist view of tribalism. They suggest a second current beneath the first, a deeper capacity, not just for loyalty, but for compassion that exceeds utility. But that compassion was still, for the most part, directed inward. The question is, what happened when two tribes met? The answer lies in a paradox. Across many early human sites, there is evidence of both contact and conflict. Trade goods from distant regions suggest cooperation. Shared technologies point to learning and adaptation. But other sites, marked by trauma, fire, and abrupt disappearance, hint at darker encounters. We do not know the details. The past has no camera roll, but the pattern is consistent. Humans were capable of both alliance and annihilation, depending on the story they believed. Because story, ultimately, was the gatekeeper. To see another tribe as human, there had to be a framework. Shared rituals, language, marriage ties, mutual need. Without these bridges, the instinct was not curiosity but caution. Sometimes contempt, sometimes worse. In many ways, that instinct still lingers. You can feel it in the unease that flickers when entering a new culture. The subtle othering in jokes, in politics, in the fear of dilution. We crave connection, but often only within recognizable codes. And yet, some groups did build bridges. Anthropologists studying modern forager societies have found that interband marriage, guest-right customs, and shared ceremonial gatherings helped expand the social circle beyond blood. These weren't just acts of tolerance, they were survival strategies, because isolation could be deadly, and diversity of knowledge, especially in a changing climate, was life. So while tribalism could fracture and exclude, it could also evolve. It could reach outward, slowly, unevenly, but only when it didn't feel threatened. And that's the challenge. The more insecure a group feels, the tighter its circle becomes. The more pressure from the environment, the more fragile its identity. The more dangerous the outside world begins to seem. Even now, this dynamic plays out in times of crisis, economic collapse, pandemics, war. These moments often reignite the ancient wiring. We reach for what's familiar, we protect our own, and in doing so, sometimes we forget our larger self, the self that remembers we are all one species, one lineage, one long breath, exhaled through 1,000 different tongues. And yet, the echo's always familiar, because beneath the differences of tribe, of tongue, of totem, there is a common architecture. The way we cradle our infants, the way we grieve, the way we gather around light and tell stories into the night. It is here, in these subtle rhythms, that we glimpse the deeper truth, that belonging is not limited to the lines we draw, but to the spaces we share. Still, those lines persist. They are ancient, etched into our instincts. And so, the human story remains suspended between two poles, the need for closeness and the fear of dilution, the desire to merge and the need to remain distinct. It is a tension that shaped our earliest rituals. Consider the masks used in initiation rites. Found in some of the oldest ceremonial sites, these masks were not only symbols, they were transformations. They marked the moment a child became part of something larger, a tribe, a tradition, an identity. But such rituals also reinforced division. There were the initiated and the outsiders, those who spoke the sacred words and those who did not. This duality of unification and exclusion would echo forward for millennia. It is why religions carry both mercy and fire, why nations wave flags of welcome with one hand and build fences with the other, why every anthem is both a song and a boundary. But maybe the question isn't whether tribalism is good or bad. Maybe it's whether we recognize it for what it is. An ancient survival tool, a code written in hunger and cold, in darkness and firelight, a force that lifted us from extinction, but one that must now be wielded with care. Because today the stakes are different. We no longer live in scattered bands. Our circles have expanded. Our challenges, climate change, displacement, global inequality, demand a broader form of belonging. A belonging not built on shared blood, but shared future. And here's the quiet hope. The same neural pathways that once helped us protect our clan can also help us protect the stranger. Because empathy is plastic. It can be taught, grown, expanded. When we hear someone's story, our brain begins to map them as kin. The firelit circle grows wider, the boundary softens, and the story of us changes shape, not erasing difference, but holding it, with curiosity, with care. This, perhaps, is the evolution tribalism never expected, that in a world of 7 billion, survival may now depend on how far we're willing to stretch the word we. Not to dissolve our roots, but to braid them. So as we look back into the shadows of our ancestry, we do so not to condemn the tribal mind, but to understand it, to see its beauty and its danger, its warmth and its fire. And maybe in that fire, still burning beneath the scaffolding of modern life, we will find not an enemy to destroy, but an inheritance to reimagine. The Ice Age never ended, it simply moved inside us. Though its glaciers have long since receded and the great herds of mammoth have vanished into sediment and myth, the marks it left behind are not only carved into stone or bone, but into the folds of the human brain, the circuits of emotion, the chemistry of survival. We are not simply descended from those who endured the long cold. We are haunted by their strategies. What if you're not just feeling fear, love, envy, or loyalty, but echoes of decisions made around ancient fires, long before language had a name for them? What if your instincts are fossils, psychological artifacts, shaped not by your lifetime, but by 1,000 generations of blood memory? It begins with something so small it's invisible, oxytocin, a molecule, a whisper of bonding passed between mothers and infants, lovers and allies. But in the crucible of the Pleistocene, this chemical wasn't just for comfort, it was a gatekeeper. It told the body, this one is safe, this one is kin. And by exclusion it marked others, unfamiliar, untrusted, possibly dangerous. It sharpened the blade between us and them, not out of hatred but necessity. In a world of scarce resources and real threats, trusting too freely could be fatal, and so evolution tightened the circle. But trust is only half the story. The other half is fear, more specifically fear that learns. In laboratory studies today, researchers observe a phenomenon called fear conditioning. A rat exposed to a painful shock in a specific environment will come to freeze in fear just by being placed in the same space again. But what's more striking is what happens next. Rats, who merely observe others in distress, or smell their stress hormones, can develop the same response. Fear, it turns out, can be contagious. It does not need to be lived, it only needs to be witnessed. The same mechanisms exist in humans. We don't just fear what hurt us, we fear what hurt our people. The scream of an ancestor, even if never heard directly, leaves behind a kind of residue. This is the logic of trauma, of inherited phobia, of ancient caution dressed in modern clothing. What happens when those instincts, once tuned to the crack of a twig or the scent of a predator, are released into a world of cities and screens? We find them everywhere, masquerading as culture. In loyalty to a football team, in devotion to a flag, in suspicion of the unfamiliar accent, in pride for a religious symbol we never chose but inherited. We fight for these things with an urgency that seems irrational, until you remember that, once, they were proxies for life itself. When the world was ice, the tribe was warmth. The symbol was shelter. The shared identity was food, safety, and the promise of return. But have we ever truly updated the emotional code? Or are we still dreaming through Ice Age logic, in a world that no longer matches its design? Because if we are, the evidence is all around us. Consider the shape of modern politics, the sharp boundary lines, the rallying cries, the tribal signals etched not into body paint or beads, but into bumper stickers, hashtags, and slogans. It is the same architecture, group identity built on emotional glue, not reason. Neuroscience confirms this. fMRI studies show that political affiliation activates brain regions tied to self-identity, not detached evaluation. To question the ideology is, in a very real sense, to threaten the self. These aren't rational affiliations, they are limbic, tribal. And what about war? Not as strategy or geopolitics, but as human behaviour. Why is it so often wrapped in the language of sacred duty? Why does it so easily tap into feelings of righteousness, revenge and honour? Because our brains, shaped in bands of 100, were designed to protect the group at any cost. When the in-group is in danger, cortisol rises, heart rate spikes, pain thresholds increase, even empathy shifts. Studies show that when people view suffering in their own group, their brains light up differently than when they view it in others. The ancient wiring routes compassion along familiar lines. And it's not just war or politics, it's religion, community. Even entertainment. Think of a stadium filled with thousands chanting in unison, painted in team colours, celebrating triumphs or mourning losses they did not directly experience. It's a ritual, it's a myth, and it feels profound. Why? Because it scratches the same ancestral itch. The need to belong, to signal loyalty, to merge with something larger. In the Ice Age, this kind of synchrony may have kept us alive. Coordinated group hunting, mutual defence, cohesive identity. Now it powers Super Bowl Sundays and Olympic ceremonies. And then there's nationalism, a construct barely a few centuries old, yet embraced with the fervour of religion. Flags flutter like tribal banners. Founding myths are repeated like origin stories around the fire. And dissent in many places is treated not as disagreement, but as betrayal. But perhaps the most haunting sign of our Ice Age inheritance is this. We still teach children who to fear, not always directly, but subtly, through language, through tone, through which faces are called strange, which histories are taught, and which ones are not. And those children, like the pups of a wary mammal species, learn the scent of the in-group, learn the posture of caution, learn who smiles like home and who doesn't. This is not cynicism. It is pattern recognition. It is the recognition that our ancestors didn't just give us bones and blood. They gave us reflexes, templates, ghost maps of belonging and threat, generosity and suspicion, passed silently from generation to generation. But here, a question arises. If these patterns are inherited, can they also be rewired? Can we reshape the ancient reflex? Or are we, even now, passengers in a vessel built for another world? Because that is the hidden paradox of evolution. It prepares us exquisitely for a world that no longer exists. The human brain, this vast cathedral of memory and emotion, was carved by necessity, not foresight. It does not adapt in real time to skyscrapers or algorithms. It carries the logic of campfires and predators. It assumes threats have faces, and that trust must be earned with time, touch, and shared effort. In a digital age, these instincts are misdirected, sometimes dangerously so. Our modern tools can outpace our ancient minds. Take social media. It appears modern, glowing screens, invisible signals, but it operates like a hyperactive tribal network. Likes and shares become forms of grooming, much like primates picking fleas. Outrage travels faster than calm, because negative emotions evolved as warnings, not entertainment. Algorithms don't create this dynamic. They exploit it, feeding us content that affirms our biases, inflames our fears, and stokes tribal loyalty. In evolutionary terms, it's like pouring accelerant onto ancestral firewood. But even beyond the digital sphere, blood memory finds other channels. Studies on oxytocin, for example, reveal something unsettling. While often called the love hormone, its effects are conditional. It enhances empathy, but mostly toward those perceived as part of one's group. In fact, it can increase distrust toward outsiders. The same chemical that bonds a mother to her child can also reinforce prejudice. Kindness and exclusion are not opposites. They are twins, born from the same ancient code, protect your own, and this code runs deeper still. Behavioral economists have found that people are more willing to cooperate when they believe they share a common identity, even if it's arbitrarily assigned. In experiments, groups labelled with simple tags like blue team and red team quickly develop favoritism, even when the groupings are meaningless. The tribal mind doesn't ask for logic. It asks only for markers, a symbol, a flag, a chant. and from there it builds loyalty and suspicion with startling speed. But if these patterns are so deeply embedded, what does that say about free will? Are we fated to repeat the Ice Age in every generation, only dressed in new clothes? The answer perhaps lies not in denial, but in awareness. Because while evolution shaped our instincts, it also gave us something unprecedented: metacognition, the ability to think about our thinking, to recognize a reflex for what it is, and decide whether to follow it. No other species can do this. No other lineage has peered into its own emotional circuitry and asked, why do I feel this way? This may be our most profound inheritance, not just the blood memory, but the ability to listen to it, question it, and choose when to obey, and when to rewrite the code. But rewriting is not erasing. It begins by naming, by mapping the ancient contours of fear and belonging, not to abolish them, but to grow beyond their original design. Because to know the ghost is to free the house, and the ghosts are many. They linger not just in our behaviours, but in our myths, our metaphors, even our stories of self. The archetype of the noble hero, rising to defend their people, the betrayal of the outsider, the promise of paradise for those who stay loyal, and punishment for those who stray. These aren't just literary tropes. They are ancestral narratives, passed down like stone tools, reshaped across generations. They encode old truths in new tongues. But this inheritance, while ancient, is not immutable. In the last few decades, epigenetics has offered a new lens on old instincts. We now know that life experiences, especially those involving trauma or social cohesion, can leave molecular marks on the genome. These marks don't change the DNA code, but they affect how it's expressed, like notes scribbled into the margins of a musical score. Astonishingly, some of these marks can be passed down. Descendants of Holocaust survivors, for example, show different patterns of stress hormone regulation. The echo of fear becomes physiology. Memory, it seems, is not just cognitive, it is cellular. And still, even with this burden, we adapt. We build institutions that try to stretch the tribal circle, laws, rights, declarations of shared humanity. These are attempts to override the instinct that says, only protect your own. And while these structures are fragile and often fail, they are also miracles, because they represent something new in the evolutionary story, conscious resistance to the old algorithm. It's worth remembering how recent this resistance is. For over 95% of human history, our ancestors lived in small bands. Everyone you knew, you likely knew for life. Trust was personal, identity was fixed. The brain adapted to this reality, fine-tuning itself to navigate the intimate politics of the tribe. Then, in a flash, agriculture, cities, nations, the social scale exploded. Our hardware didn't change. Only the game board did, so we improvise. We create symbolic kinship, nationalities, religions, teams, ideologies that allow us to feel bonded to strangers. It's not an illusion, it's an adaptation, a bridge between ancient reflexes and modern complexity. But these bridges are double-edged. They can expand compassion or narrow it. They can promote peace or justify war. It depends not on the biology, but on the stories we build atop it. And that, perhaps, is where hope lies. Because we are not blank slates, but neither are we prisoners. We are authors with the draft inherited from deep time. We carry the voices of survivors, yes, but also the capacity to listen, to revise, to say, this fear served my ancestors, but does it serve me now? This question is not academic. It is spiritual. It touches every act of judgment, every moment of trust, every boundary we draw between us and them, and it returns us to the campfires of our ancestors, where the first stories began, stories that told who belonged, who didn't, and who we might yet become. Because that, in the end, is what separates us from the reflexes we inherited. The ability to ask what else is possible, to stand before the tug of tribal instinct, not to silence it, but to understand it, to trace its contours and origins, to feel its weight without being ruled by it, and then perhaps to choose another way. Not a world without belonging, but a world where belonging does not require an enemy. This isn't about transcendence, it's about stewardship, tending to the inner terrain the Ice Age left behind, recognizing when fear masquerades as righteousness, noticing when loyalty is used to close doors rather than open hearts. It means remembering that the instincts which once helped 100 people survive a winter may not serve 8 billion living through a melting planet. We still crave the warmth of the tribe. But the tribe now is everyone. We feel it in the ache of polarization, in the way communities fracture under the strain of difference. We feel it when we mistake discomfort for danger, or disagreement for betrayal. These are not failures of character, they are echoes of a time when difference meant threat, when the unfamiliar often did bring death. But the unfamiliar also brought something else. It brought fire carried from another camp, words in another tongue that became your lullabies, a stranger who taught you a better way to catch fish, an outsider whose blood now flows through your veins. We are all hybrids, genetically, culturally, emotionally. The myth of purity is just that, a myth. The genetic record shows no tribe was ever truly isolated. Genes moved, ideas moved, stories moved, sometimes gently, sometimes through violence, but always, in the background, was the truth our ancestors didn't have the tools to say out loud. We survived through connection, not separation. And now, we have a choice, to honour our inheritance by evolving beyond it, to make tribalism conscious, to turn it from a reflex into a practice, to ask, who is my group, and then answer with courage, not fear, to include, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary, because this moment in history doesn't call for the strongest, or the smartest, it calls for the most connected, not in sentiment, but in structure, not in slogans, but in shared purpose. We still carry Ice Age tribalism in our bones, but bones are only the beginning of a story. They support us. They do not define us. The firelight still flickers, the circle still gathers, but the world around the fire is larger now, and it is asking softly, fiercely, who will you let inside? They say the lone genius stands apart, shaping the world with sheer vision. But what if that is only a modern myth? What if the true engine of innovation was never the individual, but the invisible village behind them? When we imagine progress, we often picture a singular figure. Archimedes in his bath, Newton beneath an apple tree, Einstein scribbling into silence. But no mind forms in isolation. From the very first flickers of symbolic thought to the layered languages of today, cognition itself was not a solo performance. It was a chorus, a village of minds sharing a fire. Even now, every idea you have is scaffolded by countless others. The words you use, the metaphors you inherit, the problems you imagine solving, all are social artifacts. Even solitude, when it nourishes insight, is only possible because somewhere, someone first taught you to speak. So how far back does the architecture of this mental village go? Can we trace it beyond writing, beyond agriculture, beyond even speech? Anthropologists speak of cumulative culture, the compounding of knowledge over generations. And in the Upper Paleolithic, this became a roaring engine. Technologies did not just appear and vanish. They were remembered, honed, transmitted. Across thousands of years, the design of an atlatl or a bone needle grew more refined, not because one mind mastered the task, but because each mind added a stitch to the thread. To pass on that thread, humans developed something extraordinary, ultra-sociality. Unlike other species that lived in large groups, like wolves or chimpanzees, humans went further. We began to specialize, to divide labor not just between genders, but across age and skill. We entrusted chilled rearing to grandparents, storytelling to elders, and danger to hunters. No one person knew how to do everything, but together the village did. And what kept this fragile organism of shared mind alive? Ritual. Ritual is not just superstition, it is mnemonic architecture, a way to encode memory into the rhythm of the year, the cycle of planting and harvest, of migration and return. In Ice Age societies, long before ploughs or priests, people gathered at sacred places to reenact stories, mark celestial events, honour the bones of ancestors. These were not diversions, they were libraries. Rituals were the books we danced instead of read. How do you ensure knowledge outlasts a single voice? You give it rhythm, you give it meaning, you wrap it in emotion so it becomes unforgettable, and slowly across generations the village in the mind began to take shape. But if we are built to remember together, what happens when the bonds fray? What happens when the village becomes too large, too distant, too virtual? Does the architecture collapse or does it evolve? When the fire is no longer visible, but the stories still echo, do we still belong to one another? Or are we wandering through the ruins of a memory built for another time? To answer that, we must look not at skyscrapers or fibre optic cables, but at the gatherings that still happen in shadow and song. Weddings, funerals, birthdays, bonfires, graduations. These are not just calendar events. They are modern rituals, echoes of something ancient. Because even as the world grows more complex, something in us reaches back. The festival, the feast, the shared dance. These are not frivolous. They are structural. They are how we remember who we are together. And they are how we transmit the invisible codes of tribe, loyalty, rhythm, sacrifice, joy. In early human societies, seasonal festivals often marked more than the changing of the sun. They stitched together clans spread across vast landscapes. A solstice feast was not only a celebration, it was a recalibration of identity. Who is here? Who is gone? Who has come of age? It was a census of belonging performed in myth and music. And though the tools have changed, the impulse remains. Think of a sports stadium, a music festival, a political rally. These are not just events, they are recreations of the ancient circle. We stand shoulder to shoulder, chant shared phrases, wear colours that mark us as kin. We cry when others cry, cheer when others cheer. The body synchronises, the individual blurs. And for a moment, we return to something older than logic. Anthropologist Victor Turner called this communitas, the fleeting sense of unity that dissolves hierarchies and turns crowds into tribes. It is powerful, it is real, and it is why humans will always seek each other out, even when the cost is high. Because the village is not a place, it is a structure inside us. Even our digital world, despite its distractions, reveals this yearning. Online fandoms form around shared myths. Hashtags become signals of belonging. Discord servers mimic the campfire, a small chatty circle with inside jokes and unspoken rules. Memes, those strange fragments of culture, are not nonsense. They are rituals in miniature, symbols repeated, mutated, passed along. Of course, digital kinship is not the same as physical community. It lacks scent, skin, the subtle cues of presence. But it also transcends borders, forging tribes across oceans. The danger lies not in the existence of these virtual villages, but in forgetting that they are still tribes, that they can still exclude, still echo, still burn. The architecture persists, even when the scaffolding changes. We carry the Ice Age village not only in our bones but in our browsers. And sometimes, when the algorithm hums just right, we feel the same pull, the joy of recognition, the rush of inclusion, the peril of conformity. We gather, we share, we echo. Because deep down, we're not designed to go it alone. The village may now be woven through code and screens, but it is still lit by the same fire, the one that says, "You are not alone, you are one of us." And yet, for all its warmth, the village in the mind is not just a comfort. It is also a scaffold for cognition. This is what modern psychology increasingly shows, that thought is not isolated inside the skull, but extended outward, into the environment, the group, the tools we share. This is the principle of distributed cognition, a concept born not in mythology, but in cognitive science, yet it feels uncannily ancestral. It suggests that problem-solving, memory and innovation do not live in a single brain. They are offloaded into language, gesture, story, and most importantly into the social web. Consider how a navigator on a Polynesian canoe doesn't hold every variable in his mind. He sings his way across the sea, recalling islands through rhythm and chant. The knowledge is not stored, it is performed. Or think of a child learning to count using fingers, sticks, or stones. Their thinking extends beyond the self, and in that extension, the tribe lives on. In prehistoric times, this meant that survival was not just a matter of sharp eyes or fast legs, but of shared memory, carried in rituals, taught through imitation, reinforced through story. A hunter did not need to know everything, only where to stand, what gesture to follow, when to run. The rest was already embedded in others. This is why, when we look at Ice Age artifacts, we're not just looking at art or tools, we're looking at fragments of externalized thought. A carved bone may be a counting device. A handprint on a cave wall may be both signature and instruction. A song, passed from one generation to the next, may contain encoded migration routes or seasonal warnings. In the Paleolithic mind, the line between individual and group was porous, and that porousness is still visible today. We call it culture. But what is culture, if not memory held outside the self? It is why grief feels so destabilizing, because it's not just a person we lose, but part of the collective mind. The joke they remembered, the song they sang, the way they knew exactly how to soothe a crying baby or cook the root that no one else liked. When someone dies, it is not only love that vanishes, it is architecture. But likewise, when we come together, when we share a meal or pass on a recipe or repeat a phrase an elder once used, something returns. The village reasserts itself, not in buildings, but in bonds. And so the architecture remains, not in stone but in story, not in maps but in memory. We are not alone in our thinking, we never have been. The village thinks through us just as we think through it. And perhaps that is why the myth of the lone genius rings so hollow, even as it persists in our culture. The scientist in the lab coat, the inventor in the garage, the philosopher beneath a tree, we love the image of solitary brilliance. But when we peel back the myth, we find something else. An invisible village of mentors, peers, rivals, ancestors. Even the most celebrated minds stood on the shoulders of many. Newton, famously, claimed he saw farther by standing on the shoulders of giants. But who were those giants? Teachers, friends, forgotten scribes, the unnamed generations that refined language, number, myth, and passed them forward. This, too, is an echo of Ice Age cognition. No invention emerges in a vacuum. It ripples outward from a network of bodies and minds in contact. In the Upper Paleolithic, we see a sudden flourishing. Beads, ochre, cave art, bone flutes. Not because someone discovered art, but because the social lattice had become dense enough to transmit complexity quickly, adaptively. Ideas, like fire, needed tinder and breath, and the tribe provided both. Even today, this remains true. We often imagine intelligence as a matter of IQ, a private capacity locked inside a brain. But perhaps we should think of intelligence more like music, something that happens between people, across time, through improvisation and response. When a village functions well, it becomes a thinking organism. One person senses a change in the wind, another notices the patterns in the birds, a third remembers that this happened once before, many winters ago. And together they decide to move. No single person held the full picture. But the picture existed. And isn't that still true? A modern city with its traffic lights, weather alerts, and networks of communication is just a scaled-up version of that process. We survive not by raw strength or solitary brilliance, but by distributed awareness, by trust, by listening. Even gossip, that often maligned human trait, plays a role. Evolutionary biologists suggest that gossip is not trivial. It is infrastructure. It is how we track trust, detect betrayal, reinforce norms. In Ice Age bands, where every alliance was a lifeline, this was vital. Gossip wasn't just entertainment, it was memory management. It told you who had shared food, who had broken a promise, who could be trusted on the next hunt. So when we sit around the metaphorical campfires of today, texting in group chats, sharing memes, discussing scandals, we are still doing it, still maintaining the village, still checking for cracks in the structure. And if we sometimes feel overwhelmed by it all, the noise, the closeness, the pressure, perhaps it is because our minds were shaped in circles of 50, not cities of 5 million. Yet still, the architecture adapts. Still, we find ways to belong. Because even in the digital expanse of the 21st century, where bonds are forged through screens and kinship is declared in usernames, the same ancient impulses hum beneath the surface. The need to gather, the need to share, the need to say, you are seen, you are part of us. Anthropologists now talk about urban tribes, clusters of chosen affiliation that mimic the intimacy and trust of ancestral bands. These tribes form around shared values, aesthetics, rituals. They are not bound by blood or geography, but by resonance. A book club, a street dance crew, a group of climate activists chaining themselves to an old tree, even virtual spaces where avatars sit beside one another on pixelated mountains, carry the echoes of Firelight. In each case, there is something more than convenience at play. There is structure, invisible, emotional, and essential. And it isn't just a metaphor. The brain responds. Studies show that even transient moments of connection, a shared joke, a synchronized movement, a song sung together, can release oxytocin, regulate heart rate, lower cortisol. We are physically calmed by belonging, and stressed by isolation. When people are socially excluded, even in the most artificial of laboratory experiments, the brain registers it like physical pain. The same regions light up. The anterior cingulate cortex, the insula, as if the person had been struck. This is not a bug. It is a feature, a holdover from deep time, when exclusion meant death and being welcomed meant life. So today, in boardrooms and bars, online games and neighborhood potlucks, we continue to rehearse the ancient dance. We seek alignment, affirmation, mirroring. We tell stories, we listen, we nod, we laugh at the same moment. All of it still tribal. Even our crises carry this signature. Polarization, conspiracy, radicalization. These two are misfires of the same circuitry, where belonging becomes distorted and the village becomes a weapon. But beneath the noise, the architecture remains unchanged. It yearns for integration, for harmony. And maybe that's the real message carried forward through millennia. Not that tribalism is inherently violent or kind, but that it is fundamentally structural, an inheritance of perception, not just preference, a framework of the mind. To see this is not to judge it, but to recognize its shape. And in doing so, perhaps we loosen its grip. We can begin to ask, which village am I building? Who do I invite in? Who have I left out? Because the village in the mind is not fixed. It can expand. That's the gift of culture, its plasticity, its potential. And so we sit at the edge of memory and invention, with old instincts and new tools, still whispering to each other in the dark, still making meaning in circles, still keeping the fire alive. Because long before we built walls or cities or nations, we built something else. We built each other. The tribe may have saved us, but can it still serve us? There is a fragile brilliance in what we inherited, a memory not of fire or tools, but of one another. In the abyss of the Ice Age, when the world turned against life, it was not just the sharpness of our flints or the cleverness of our traps that saw us through. It was the circle, the quiet trust between eyes. The unspoken vow of the group, I will carry you when you fall, and you will do the same. This promise, older than agriculture, older than cities, older even than language as we know it, was the foundation beneath our survival. But as the wind changes, as the glaciers withdraw and the world fills with unfamiliar shapes, how much weight can that old promise bear? When the circle was small, its strength lay in its simplicity. A face was either known or unknown. A gesture either trusted or doubted. The mind evolved under these constraints, building entire systems of emotion, judgment and decision-making around that simple binary. Us or not us. Oxytocin, the hormone that surges in mothers and lovers and allies alike, did not emerge to flood the halls of United Nations meetings. It bloomed in the moment one human fed another by the fire. It reinforced the neural path that said, this is kin, this is mine. Empathy was never born as a wide lens. It was a tight beam, and in the tundra's crucible, that beam was enough. But now the circle is not so small. Now the faces exceed what the mind can catalogue. The village is not 20 souls. It is 8 billion. The stone wall has been replaced by borders carved by ink and treaty. Information flows across the planet faster than a hunter's arrow ever flew. We are, in every measurable sense, one interdependent species facing shared collapse. Yet the wiring behind our eyes remains Ice Age software. We walk through modernity with ancient algorithms still humming beneath our every gesture. Can they be trusted? Trust, once implicit within the tribe, now fractures under scale. Institutions attempt to replace it with laws, with treaties, with votes. But laws are not oxytocin, and the firelit circle, once so small and vivid, now flickers uncertainly across digital screens and political banners. It's a flicker that struggles to hold in the winds of chaos, of climate breakdown, of mass migration, of ideological fracture. The mind sees faces, but still it searches for the old markers. Who speaks like me? Who prays like me? Who would carry me if I stumbled? What happens when a species designed for intimacy is thrust into infinity? When a global crisis strikes, a virus, a drought, a flood, the instincts roar to life, hoard, blame, protect the known. These responses, forged in the survival logic of small groups, now lash like wild animals in a glass house. The problem is not that tribalism is unnatural. The problem is that it is too natural, and nature has changed. The challenges that loom before us are no longer local. They do not wait outside the cave mouth or rise with the seasonal thaw. They are planetary in scale, slow-moving but total in effect. A warming atmosphere does not distinguish between one tribe and another. A rising sea has no flag. The nuclear fire, like the old fire, can warm or destroy, but now its embers are managed not by a handful of elders, but by distant strangers entrusted with machines beyond comprehension. And still, within us, the old instincts murmur. When the tribe kept to itself, its loyalties were strength. A band of 20 who would risk life for one another could weather starvation, predators, disease. That solidarity was precious and costly, because the very loyalty that fused the group also forged the wall that kept others out. Today, those walls are papered over with policy and principle, but they remain, embedded in our cognition like deep stone foundations beneath a modern city. The impulse to divide, to retreat to the familiar in times of stress, is ancient and reflexive, and in the face of modern uncertainty, it flares with renewed intensity. We see it in every corner of global life, a resurgence of nationalism, tribal politics, echo chambers, identity fundamentalism. The world grows more interconnected, and yet more divided. This is not hypocrisy, it is psychology. The more complex the world becomes, the more the mind yearns for simplicity. And tribal simplicity is the oldest there is. But simplicity will not save us. The very threats we now face, ecological collapse, pandemics, displaced populations, resource scarcity, are collective in origin and solution. They demand trust between strangers, empathy without proximity, shared sacrifice without shared blood. That is a hard ask for a brain built in bands of Dunbar's number. 150 souls, give or take, before names blur and trust phrase. And yet that is what we must now build. A trust that spans beyond biology, beyond geography, beyond myth. There is precedent, faint though it may be. In times of great crisis, world wars, famines, plagues, the human animal has sometimes reached beyond its wiring. There are stories of soldiers from opposite trenches singing together on Christmas Eve, of neighbours opening their doors during storms, of scientists from rival nations sharing data to halt a disease. These are not anomalies, they are expansions, temporary widening of the circle. The question is whether such expansions can last. Is it possible to keep the circle open when the crisis fades? Can empathy become a habit, not just an emergency response? These are not technical problems. They are cultural, neurological, emotional. They sit at the intersection of evolution and imagination, and they test the boundaries of what it means to be human, not just in the past tense, but in the unfolding present, because the fire is still flickering, but the wind is rising. And what is the flame, really, but a symbol for the human compact? It must be fed, protected, passed along, never assumed. In the Paleolithic dark, that flame was survival. Now, it is something else. A metaphor for the fragile interdependence of a globalized species, one that still carries Ice Age fears but holds tools of unimaginable consequence. Our reach has expanded, but has our wisdom kept pace? To survive the Ice Age, our ancestors developed a profound sense of us. To survive the Anthropocene, we may need to develop a profound sense of all. But such a leap does not come easily. It asks us to override the very impulses that once made us safe, to extend kinship where there is no face, no shared tongue, no memory. It asks us to treat strangers like relatives, to hear stories not our own and let them move us. In a species adapted for tribal cohesion, this is no small feat. It is an evolutionary rebellion, and perhaps an evolutionary necessity. Consider the idea of expanding the circle. Philosophers have called it the moral circle, a growing boundary of empathy that has widened over millennia. Once it held only kin, then tribe, then perhaps nation. In some places it now holds animals, ecosystems, even unborn generations. This widening is not linear, it stalls, contracts, is fought and resisted. But it is also real. History offers scattered but luminous signs of it. Emancipation, suffrage, civil rights, conservation, global humanitarian aid. Each of these was an act of remembering something our biology forgot, that we are not as separate as we feel. And yet the circle's growth is fragile. It expands with education, connection, and peace. But under stress, economic, environmental, social, it tightens. The unfamiliar becomes the enemy. The stranger becomes the threat. Old instincts rise like smoke from ancient fires. Protect your own. Close the gate. The tribe, once again, becomes fortress and filter. This is the paradox of the modern world. We need to cooperate globally, but we still feel locally. We need to plan for centuries, but we still react like hunters at dusk. The fires we sit around now are abstract. International institutions, digital forums, global summits. But unless they kindle genuine belonging, genuine shared story, they fail to replace what the Ice Age once provided, the intimacy of commitment. Is such intimacy scalable? Can a world of billions find a way to feel small again? Not in scope, but in spirit. Perhaps the solution lies not in abandoning tribal instincts, but in repurposing them. To treat the global as local, to build tribes not of blood but of care, to cultivate rituals, languages and identities that bind across difference rather than within it. These are not fantasies, they are social technologies, and like fire they can be learned, shaped, shared. But we must choose to light them, and we must choose to keep them lit. That choice is neither automatic nor easy. The circuits in our brains that once synchronized with the rhythm of a small band, that pulsed with oxytocin when we heard a familiar voice, or sparked with caution at the scent of a stranger, those circuits still fire. But now they fire in a world where our strangers may live continents away, and our kin may be people we've never met in person. Globalization has redrawn the map, but not the mind. The same ancient chemistry that once helped us form alliances can now amplify outrage, mistrust, and ideological barricades. And yet, here is the fragile hope. Our brains, while ancient, are not static. Neural plasticity, the capacity to rewire in response to experience, means that we can train ourselves and each other toward broader empathy. We are not slaves to tribalism. We are its inheritors, and inheritors can choose what to keep and what to lay down. Imagine a world where identity is expansive, not exclusive. Where the story of us is not defined by who we are against, but what we are for. This is not naive optimism. It is behavioural possibility. Studies show that cooperation between groups increases when people work toward a shared goal, when they eat together, build together, sing together. These echoes of our evolutionary past, communal labour, ritual feasting, coordinated movement, still work. The trick is remembering to use them. Perhaps in that sense we need to rebuild the old fire circles, not in caves or clearings, but in classrooms, community centres, town halls, and yes, even online. Spaces where people come not to argue their sides, but to re-encounter their shared humanity, to be seen. To listen, to remember what it feels like to be held by a group, not because everyone agrees, but because everyone matters. The challenges are immense. Climate change, artificial intelligence, displaced populations, fragile democracies. These are not abstractions. They are forces already in motion, already shaping lives, and facing them will require a kind of unity that is not yet fully real. But there are glimmers. Youth-led climate movements that cross borders, global research collaborations in medicine, storytelling platforms where millions share and learn across cultural lines. These are not solutions, but signals. Proof that something else is possible, flickering at the edge of the firelight. Still, the old instincts will resist. Fear is faster than thought, division is easier than dialogue, and when scarcity looms, the tribe recoils. That is the moment when the real work begins, not in resisting our tribal nature, but in refining it. In choosing to see the world not as a battleground of us versus them, but as a fragile, flickering circle that we're all sitting inside. The circle is not yet wide enough, but it can be, if we remember how to tend it, And tending, like firekeeping, is slow work. It requires patience, vigilance, and humility. Our ancestors understood this instinctively. Around their Paleolithic hearths, the flame was never left alone. Someone always watched it, fed it, protected it from wind and rain. In this sense, the tribe was not just a social unit, but a living organism, a breathing promise. We will care for the warmth that cares for us. Now we must decide if that promise still holds. Global interconnection has linked our destinies more tightly than ever before. What happens in one region echoes across oceans, economically, ecologically, emotionally. A virus in one city can change life across continents. A melting glacier in the Arctic shifts weather in the tropics. And yet, even as the facts of our entanglement grow clearer, the feeling of common purpose remains elusive. We are bound together materially, but not yet spiritually. This dissonance between connection and cohesion is the defining tension of our age, and it is here that the lessons of tribal survival must evolve. Not be discarded, but grown. What made the Paleolithic tribe so resilient was not just shared blood, but shared meaning. Rituals, symbols, songs. Stories that reminded each person that their life was part of something larger. Not just a body in space, but a role in a story. So the question becomes, can we craft such stories again, at scale? Can we create new myths, new symbols, new rituals that honour difference while affirming belonging? This is not a call for utopia. It is a call for craftsmanship, cultural craftsmanship, using the ancient tools of identity to build bridges instead of borders. Perhaps the flag of the future is not a nation's banner, but a tapestry woven from 1,000 stories, not uniform but unified. The fragility of this project cannot be overstated. Polarization is powerful. Algorithms reward outrage. The slow, steady language of empathy is often drowned out by the drumbeats of fear. And yet, as history has shown, cultural tides can turn. Norms shift. Compassion can go viral, just as much as conflict can. It begins with what we teach our children, what we reward in our leaders, what we praise in our media, what we dare to imagine in our art. Maybe this is what it means to be human now, to carry two timelines at once. One from the ice, ancient, instinctive, wary. One from the future, fragile, collective, brave. And to walk, step by step, toward their integration. We are the descendants of survivors. But survival alone is not the goal anymore. The fire they passed to us still burns, and we are its stewards, not only for ourselves, but for the generations who will one day gather around it, wondering how we kept it alive. We kept it alive, we hope, by remembering the tribe must grow, or the fire will die. The final question: what kind of tribe will we become, now that survival no longer depends on exclusion? Once, long ago, survival meant drawing lines in the snow, between the warmth of kin and the hunger beyond. It meant choosing who to trust and who to fear. It meant shrinking the world into something small enough to hold around a fire. But now, in the trembling light of the Anthropocene, those lines begin to blur. The walls we built to keep each other out now echo with a strange hollowness. What happens when the ancient engine of belonging meets a world too vast to contain it? We are no longer just the tribe of the riverbank or the mountain pass. We are passengers aboard a fragile sphere, spinning through space, a single extended kin group, too large for memory, too diverse for instinct, too interdependent for rivalry. And yet, the old signals still whisper through our blood. The tug toward us and them, the warmth of shared flags, shared faiths, shared feasts, the suspicion of accents we do not understand, of stories we did not grow up hearing. How do we hold all of it? The need for closeness, and the truth of our scale. Perhaps the most radical act of this age is not invention, but reinvention, of what it means to belong. For most of human time, belonging was bounded. It had borders, taboos, sacred signs. It told us who to feed, who to grieve, who to avenge. But now, that ancient software stirs in a new machine. The family has become the city, the village has become the planet, and the story has become harder to tell. What myth is big enough to hold 8 billion hearts? The old myths gave us gods shaped like us, tribal, jealous, territorial. They sanctified war and sacrifice, loyalty and betrayal. They told us we were chosen or fallen or exiled from something pure. But slowly, something else is blooming beneath the ruins, a memory not of division, but of unity, a kinship older than any kingdom, a lineage etched not in flags but in mitochondrial whispers, in the deep time echo of shared ancestors crossing the Rift Valley, bones packed with the same fire. We are, in every measurable way, one extended family. And yet, we remain haunted by the ancient impulse to fracture. What would it take to live otherwise? Not as strangers competing for shrinking scraps, but as relatives remembering a long-forgotten song. Could we learn to see through the illusion of otherness not by erasing difference, but by revering it, as branches of the same root, wild and wondrous and deeply entangled? In the end, perhaps kinship is not a boundary but a direction, a movement outward, like ripples from a stone cast long ago into the waters of time. What happens when the circle widens until it touches everything? We begin to remember what was never truly forgotten, that every human culture, every language, every lullaby, every burial rite and dance and story, is a variation on a theme we all carry. The Ice Age did not just shape our bones, it shaped our longing, and in that longing we find the blueprint for something astonishing. Not uniformity, but harmony. Not sameness, but kinship. Because what is a tribe, really, but a story we agree to believe together? A tribe is a way of saying, these are my people, these are the ones I will help, defend, celebrate, mourn, and that impulse is not a flaw, it is a masterpiece. It allowed us to survive the abyss, to create music and shelter, to pass down warmth across unthinkable distances. The challenge now is not to discard the tribal instinct, but to repurpose it. The story can grow. Imagine a world where the idea of my people is not shrunk to borders, but expanded to include the hungry child in a distant city, the fisherman losing his reefs, the mother fleeing fire, the stranger next door. This is not utopia. It is memory, reframed, stretched, reimagined. It is the same flame that once lit mammoth bonfires on the Siberian tundra, carried now in satellites, circuits, and poems. We have always lived in many tribes at once, kinship overlapping with ritual, identity with need. Now, in the era of global interconnection, our layers multiply. Digital tribes, ideological tribes, fandoms, movements, subcultures. We are lonelier than ever, yet saturated with connection. More visible, more fragmented. The tribal brain has not disappeared. It has gone online, but somewhere in that maze the possibility remains to see beyond faction, to see that the web is not the world, it is the scaffold. The world is still made of faces, hands, seasons, bread, grief, and if we slow down, even briefly, we might feel again the oldest truth of all, that we are enough for one another. Ritual still calls to us, not in stone circles but in shared moments. The morning coffee in a quiet kitchen, the music played softly in a crowded train, the candle on a windowsill in winter. These are our new rites, subtle, portable, made for many, and through them we rehearse what the future asks of us, not less belonging, but more. Belonging that is not bought with exclusion, but woven through compassion. Perhaps one day we will see tribalism not as the cage that confined us, but the chrysalis from which we emerged. Not a prison, but a process. And still, the question lingers in the dusk. What kind of tribe will we become, now that we hold the power to imagine one vast enough for everyone? It's tempting to think we've outgrown the tribe. That civilization, with all its complexity and innovation, has rendered the old ways obsolete. But beneath our skyscrapers and satellites, the ancient architecture remains. We still form circles, around dinner tables, in online communities, at vigils, festivals and marches. We still seek mirrors in the faces of others, still scan for warmth, loyalty, threat, still yearn for a place to belong. The Paleolithic village may be gone, but its emotional blueprint lives in our cities and screens, and in that inheritance lies both promise and peril. Because when we forget how tribal we truly are, we fall victim to forces we don't recognize. We drift into echo chambers. We hunger for meaning and find it in conspiracy. We anchor to identity in ways that divide more than unite. And yet, if we can name this instinct, if we can see it not as weakness but as legacy, we may also be able to shape it, to redirect it. In anthropology, there's a term, fictive kinship, the creation of familial bonds where none biologically exist. It's what allows adoptive families, monastic orders, military units, and found families to function with loyalty as deep as blood. It is, in a sense, the technology of chosen kin, and humans are masters at it. What if our next great act as a species is to refine that skill at planetary scale? To create kinship not based on proximity or sameness, but on shared vulnerability, shared purpose, shared breath on a shared earth. That is the path of the long kinship, a slow evolution, not away from tribe, but toward its most expansive form. There are already glimmers of this future. They appear in disaster zones, when strangers form instant communities, in refugee camps, where songs still rise in the dark, in global science collaborations that stretch across continents, in stories told by those who refuse to see another human as less than kin. It's not perfect, it's not complete, but it is possible. And as we face global crises, climate change, pandemics, inequality, we are being asked again and again, how large is your circle? Who do you consider us? The truth is, survival has always depended on how far we could extend that word, us. Not as a weapon, but as an embrace. Not as a line drawn in the sand, but as a fire lit in the cold, around which more and more can gather. And when we do, when we welcome instead of wall off, when we hold instead of hoard, we are not betraying our ancestors. We are completing their work. We are honouring the raw, luminous genius that let them endure, the genius of tribe reimagined as communion. And what is communion, if not the act of sharing something sacred? In ancient times, it was food, the hunt divided. Later, it was myth and memory, stories passed like torches. Now, perhaps, it is something more elusive, attention, compassion, the decision to stay present in a world flooded with noise. Communion today might be as small as listening or as large as defending the breathability of the sky. But however it takes form, the root remains. To belong is to live. To connect is to survive. Not just biologically, but emotionally, spiritually, and ethically. This understanding has long echoed in indigenous worldviews, where the boundary of the tribe often extends to the land itself. In many of these cultures, kinship is not merely human. The forest is an ancestor, the river a sibling, the wolf a teacher. These are not metaphors but relationships, ancient, reciprocal, lived. In this way, the long kinship is not only between people, it is between all that breathes. Western science, once sceptical, is beginning to catch up. Ecologists now speak of networks of mutualism, evolutionary biologists of inclusive fitness. Even in our own microbiomes, us, the invisible constellations of bacteria inside us, we see the deep time lesson repeated. We survive by relationship. So perhaps the ultimate challenge of our age is not technology or policy, but imagination. Can we imagine a tribe so wide it includes those we'll never meet? Can we act as stewards of people we will never know, the unborn, the displaced, the silenced? Can we hold kinship with a polar bear, with a melting glacier, with a rainforest we'll never walk through? These questions are not sentimental. They are existential. Because if we cannot answer them, if the circle does not expand, the story may contract. The great lineage of survival, carried across ice and fire, might end not with a bang, but with a forgetting, a failure to recognize ourselves in others, a loneliness too vast to survive. And yet, we are not without direction. From Sumerian proverbs to Buddhist sutras, from African philosophies of Ubuntu to the interdependent web of systems in modern ecology, one lesson returns again and again. We are not alone. We never were. We were shaped by others, saved by others, made by others. The myth of individualism, so strong in recent centuries, is beginning to crumble, not in despair, but in relief. We don't have to do this alone. We never could. We were not built for it. Even the most brilliant among us, the inventors, the prophets, the rebels, stood on shoulders. They worked within languages they did not invent, thought in metaphors forged by ancestors, and when they cried out for change, they needed a tribe to echo them. In that way, the long kinship is not a retreat from the self, but it's awakening. Because to be human is to belong to something larger than the self, not in erasure, but in expansion, not in submission, but in resonance. We are notes in a chorus, sometimes discordant, sometimes in perfect harmony, but never truly solo. Even our solitude is shaped by others, and this widening of the tribe, may be the next step in the human journey. Not survival through exclusion, but through embrace. Not us versus them, but us through them. It is not a naive hope, it is an ancient pattern, rediscovered. Our ancestors didn't just huddle for warmth. They invented new ways of seeing each other. They formed customs, codes, and cultures that transformed raw instinct into shared meaning. Now, with the survival of so many hanging in balance, ecosystems, communities, species, we are being asked to do the same. To ritualize our interdependence, to tell new stories that stretch the boundary of we. It might begin in small places, in schools where children learn empathy alongside arithmetic, in neighborhoods where strangers become allies, in governance shaped not by fear but by stewardship, or it might begin inside, in you, right now, listening to this. In the quiet realization that the warmth of tribal belonging, which once glowed around ancient fires, still burns behind the breastbone. That to care is not weakness, but inheritance. That love is not soft, it is ancestral. So what kind of tribe will we be? Will we define ourselves by our walls or by our bridges, by our symbols of separation or by our gestures of inclusion? Will our myths be of conquest or of connection? The path we choose won't just determine policy or politics. It will shape the emotional climate in which future generations live and breathe. The story of tribalism is not over. It did not end with the Ice Age. It did not end with the first cities, nor with the drawing of maps. It is written now in digital forums, in protest chants, in cross-border collaborations, and in the quiet heartbreak of division. It is alive in the fears we inherit and the futures we imagine. But if we carry anything from this long journey, from the flickering firelight of our Paleolithic ancestors to the electric hum of our hyper-connected world, let it be this, that we survived not because we were the strongest, or the smartest, or the fastest. We survived because we reached for each other, because the smallest circle, drawn in trust, became the widest, because tribe became tenderness, because survival became story. And now, at the end of this story, we're perhaps, like all great tribes, we sit quietly for a moment, listening, not for danger this time, but for each other. And in that silence, perhaps we begin again, together. Thank you, fellow Sapiens, for walking this long road through the ice, where kinship flickered like firelight in the dark and the echo of ancient footsteps still stirs the dust beneath our cities. If this story helped you feel a warmth through time, and you question humming beneath your skin, or a quiet sense of wonder at the long lineage behind your gaze, then thank you, truly, for letting this story meet you where you are. I wonder what image you'll carry forward. A circle of hands around a Paleolithic fire, the long breath of the mammoth steppe, or the tender ache of being both ancient and new. Whether it was the image of oxytocin passing silently between kin, the quiet echo of forgotten burial songs under wind-carved stones, or the enduring sense of belonging stretched across digital threads and bone memory, these fragments are what connect us, scattered embers of one human story. If a moment stayed with you, I'd love to see it shared in the comments, not as noise, but as a quiet offering to those puzzling through these stories alongside you. If you'd like to follow where this thread unspools next, liking, subscribing and sharing helps keep this strange little fire lit. And there are many more trails ahead, from lost worlds to whispered myths yet to be unearthed. Until then, stay curious, stay thoughtful,